There's a moment quiet, almost invisible in the vast sweep of geological time, when a creature standing at the edge of the water made a choice. Not a conscious choice, not a deliberate decision shaped by thought or reason, but a biological turning point written into the slow language of survival. The land was behind it, the ocean stretched ahead, and something in the ancient machinery of its body began, imperceptibly at first, to change. What you are about to witness is one of the most extraordinary stories ever told by the fossil record. It is the story of animals that conquered the land, truly conquered it, freed themselves from the ancient dependency on water that had governed life for hundreds of millions of years, and then, against every expectation, turned around and went back, not because they failed on land, not because they were driven off or outcompeted into extinction, but because the ocean, that vast, ancient, resource-rich environment, called to them with the irresistible pull of evolutionary opportunity. And the creatures that answered that call became some of the most spectacular, most perfectly adapted, and most awe-inspiring animals this planet has ever produced. This is the story of the great marine reptiles. It is a story that spans more than 300 million years. It moves through catastrophic mass extinctions and explosive evolutionary radiations. It visits worlds so different from our own that they might as well be alien planets, oceans warmer and deeper than anything alive today, skies thick with volcanic gases, continents arranged in shapes that no modern map would recognize. And through all of it, threading like a silver current through the immensity of deep time, runs the extraordinary saga of reptiles, animals built for land, learning generation by generation to breathe, to move, to hunt, to give birth, and ultimately to thrive in the one environment their ancestors had worked so hard to escape. To understand how remarkable this story is, you first have to understand what the original achievement meant. You have to appreciate just how profound, how biologically difficult, and how evolutionarily significant the conquest of the land actually was. Because only when you grasp the magnitude of what it meant to leave the water, truly, permanently, reproductively leave it, can you begin to appreciate what it meant to go back. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us go back not merely thousands of years, not even millions, but hundreds of millions of years, to a world so ancient that the very continents beneath our feet were arranged in configurations that would be unrecognizable today. Let us go back to the moment when life itself first made its great leap from the sea to the shore, and from the shore to the open land, because that is where our story truly starts. More than 500 million years ago, the oceans of this planet were teeming with life. They had been teeming with life for hundreds of millions of years before that, filling their dark, pressurized depths and their sun-warmed shallows with an astonishing diversity of organisms. Jellyfish pulsed through ancient currents. Trilobites scuttled across seafloors that no human eye would ever see. Primitive fish, jawless and strange, filtered nutrients from the water column. The ocean was, in every meaningful sense, the cradle of complex life, the environment in which the basic building blocks of animal biology had been assembled, tested, refined, and passed forward through the generations. The land, by contrast, was almost entirely empty. Not completely empty, microbial mats had colonized coastal rocks, and primitive plants had begun the slow process of establishing themselves on the margins of continents. But in terms of the complex animal life that would eventually come to dominate terrestrial ecosystems, the land was a vast, open, largely unexploited frontier. The challenges it presented were enormous. There was no water to support body weight, meaning that any creature venturing onto land needed structural support, a skeleton capable of bearing its own mass against the pull of gravity. There was no water to prevent desiccation, meaning that skin and membranes needed to become far more impermeable than anything that had evolved in an aquatic environment. There was no water to distribute oxygen across gill surfaces, meaning that entirely new respiratory systems needed to evolve. And perhaps most critically of all, there was no water in which to reproduce, no medium in which eggs could be fertilized and embryos could develop safely through their vulnerable early stages. For hundreds of millions of years, these challenges kept animal life anchored to the water, or at best, to the margins between water and land. Amphibians, the first vertebrates to make serious forays onto dry land, solved some of these problems brilliantly. They evolved limbs capable of supporting their weight. They evolved lungs capable of extracting oxygen from air. They evolved sensory systems tuned to the very different physical properties of the aerial environment, but they could not solve the reproductive problem. Their eggs, like the eggs of their fish ancestors, were naked and permeable, requiring water to prevent them from drying out. Their larvae, the tadpoles and equivalent early developmental stages, were entirely aquatic. No matter how far an amphibian might wander across the land, it was always, reproductively speaking, chained to the water. It could never truly, permanently leave. The solution to this fundamental constraint, the biological innovation that would change everything, was the amniotic egg. And when it appeared, sometime around 310 to 320 million years ago, in creatures that we would recognize as the ancestors of all modern reptiles, birds, and mammals, it represented one of the most important evolutionary developments in the history of complex animal life. The amniotic egg is a marvel of biological engineering. At its heart, it is a self-contained aquatic environment, a tiny, portable ocean carried inside a protective shell. The embryo developing within an amniotic egg is surrounded by fluid-filled membranes that keep it hydrated, cushioned, and protected from the outside world. The shell itself, whether leathery or hard, depending on the species, prevents water loss while still allowing gas exchange. Waste products are stored in a specialized membrane rather than being expelled into the surrounding environment. Everything the developing embryo needs, nutrients, water, protection, is packaged together in a single, elegant, portable unit that can be deposited on dry land and left to develop without any dependence on standing water. The consequences of this innovation were staggering. Suddenly, for the first time in the history of vertebrate life, an animal could complete its entire life cycle, from egg to embryo to juvenile to adult to the laying of new eggs, without ever needing to return to water. The reproductive chain that had bound all previous vertebrates to aquatic or semi-aquatic environments was broken. The land, in all its vast, unexplored, resource-rich extent, was open. The animals that carried this revolutionary reproductive technology were the amniotes, and they wasted no time exploiting their newfound freedom. Over the tens of millions of years following the evolution of the amniotic egg, amniotes diversified explosively, spreading across the landscapes of the ancient supercontinent Pangaea and evolving into an astonishing array of forms. They split into two major lineages, the synapsids, which would eventually give rise to mammals, and the sauropsids, which would give rise to reptiles and birds. And the sauropsids, in particular, displayed a breathtaking capacity for adaptive radiation, filling ecological roles that had previously been occupied by amphibians or had simply never existed before. By around 300 million years ago, true reptiles, creatures with dry, scaly skin, efficient lungs, and the amniotic egg, were moving across landscapes that would have been unrecognizable to us. The world they inhabited was Pangaea, the vast supercontinent that at this point in geological time had gathered most of the world's landmasses into a single enormous mass. The climate was variable across this supercontinent, dry and arid in the interior, more humid along the coasts, and the ecosystems it supported were unlike anything alive today. Vast coal swamp forests of giant club mosses and tree ferns covered tropical regions, producing the thick organic deposits that would eventually, hundreds of millions of years later, be compressed into the coal seams that powered industrial civilization. Within these ancient forests and across the drier upland regions beyond them, early reptiles were establishing themselves as significant members of terrestrial ecosystems. They were not yet the dominant animals. The synapsids, the lineage leading to mammals, were actually more diverse and numerous in many environments during the early phases of the Permian period. but they were present, they were evolving, and they were laying the groundwork for the extraordinary diversification that would eventually make them the dominant terrestrial vertebrates on the planet. The diversity of early reptiles was remarkable. Some were small insectivorous creatures not unlike modern lizards, darting through the undergrowth in search of arthropods and other invertebrates. Others were larger and more heavily built, perhaps feeding on plants or on other reptiles. Some had already evolved specialized features that distinguished them from their more generalized relatives: elongated limbs, modified teeth, sensory apparatus tuned to particular ecological niches. The amniotic egg had given them the freedom to explore the land, and they were exploring it with the enthusiasm of pioneers entering a new world. But evolution is not a journey toward any particular destination. It does not move along a straight line toward complexity or specialization or any other quality we might consider desirable. It moves always and only in the direction that survival and reproduction point it. And for some lineages, some of the time, that direction pointed not further into the interior of the land, but back toward the water. Even in these early days of reptile evolution, some lineages were spending time near the margins of aquatic environments. The Permian world, despite its general trend toward aridity in many regions, still had extensive coastlines, rivers, lakes, and shallow seas. These environments were rich in food, fish, invertebrates, amphibians, and any reptile capable of exploiting them had access to resources that purely terrestrial animals could not reach. And so, even as the great majority of reptile evolution during the Permian period was pushing further and further into the exploitation of terrestrial ecosystems, some lineages were beginning, tentatively, to look back toward the water. These early experiments in semi-aquatic living were modest by comparison with what would come later. We are talking about animals that perhaps waded in shallow water, or that fed along shorelines, or that were capable of swimming short distances in search of prey. They were not yet committed to an aquatic lifestyle in the way that later marine reptiles would be. They still reproduced on land, still spent significant portions of their lives in terrestrial environments, still retained the basic body plan of a land-dwelling animal. But in the slow arithmetic of natural selection, even modest tendencies toward aquatic behavior can, given enough time and the right environmental pressures, accumulate into something far more profound. The environmental pressures, as it turned out, were about to become very significant indeed. Around 252 million years ago, the world ended. Not literally, not completely, but in biological terms, what happened at the boundary between the Permian period and the Triassic period that followed it was so catastrophic, so total in its devastation, that it deserves to be called nothing less than the greatest mass extinction in the history of complex life. Scientists estimate that somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species, and around 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared during this event, an extinction so severe that it is sometimes referred to simply as the Great Dying. The causes of the end Permian mass extinction are complex and still not entirely resolved in their precise details, but the broad picture is one of cascading environmental catastrophe. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia, the so-called Siberian traps, released enormous volumes of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other volcanic gases into the atmosphere over a period of approximately 1 million years. The carbon dioxide drove rapid global warming, raising ocean temperatures to levels that many organisms could not tolerate. The warming, in turn, triggered the release of methane from seafloor sediments, amplifying the greenhouse effect in a runaway feedback loop. Ocean chemistry shifted dramatically. Acidification reduced the ability of marine organisms to build carbonate shells, while warming and changes in ocean circulation patterns led to widespread oxygen depletion in deeper water masses. On land, temperatures soared, rainfall patterns shifted, and the complex ecosystems of the Permian were dismantled with terrifying speed. The world that emerged from the end Permian catastrophe was impoverished almost beyond imagination. The rich, diverse ecosystems of the Permian, the complex food webs, the varied communities of plants and animals that had taken hundreds of millions of years to assemble, were essentially erased. What replaced them at first were the ecological equivalents of disaster species, opportunistic organisms capable of surviving in disturbed, simplified environments, often dominated by a small number of highly stress-tolerant taxa. The recovery of ecosystem complexity was a slow, uneven process that took millions of years to unfold, but within this post-extinction world there were also opportunities. The catastrophic removal of so many established lineages had opened up ecological space on a colossal scale. The niches that had been occupied by Permian organisms were now empty, waiting to be filled by whatever survivors could evolve the necessary adaptations. And the reptiles, specifically the sauropsid reptiles that had survived the extinction, were particularly well positioned to take advantage of these opportunities. The reasons for this are not entirely clear, but several factors likely contributed. Reptile physiology, particularly the reliance on environmental rather than metabolic heat regulation, may have been advantageous in the highly disrupted, resource-poor environments of the immediate post-extinction world. The amniotic egg, with its self-contained life support system, may have been more robust to some of the environmental stresses that devastated aquatic reproduction. And the dietary flexibility of many reptile lineages may have helped them survive on whatever food sources remained available in the aftermath of the catastrophe. Whatever the reasons, the reptiles that survived the end Permian extinction burst into the ecological vacuums of the early Triassic period with extraordinary evolutionary energy. Over the course of the next few tens of millions of years, they diversified into an astonishing range of forms, filling ecological roles that had been left empty by the extinction of their Permian predecessors, and inventing entirely new ecological strategies that had never existed before. The Triassic was in many ways the great age of reptile experimentation, a period during which the basic templates of nearly all subsequent reptile evolution were established. And among the most significant of these experimental templates were the first true marine reptiles. The timing is not coincidental. The devastation of the end Permian extinction had reorganized the ocean's ecosystems as thoroughly as it had reorganized those of the land. The complex marine food webs of the Permian, the diverse communities of fish, cephalopods, echinoderms, mollusks, and other invertebrates that had supported the ocean ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years, were severely disrupted. The recovery was slow, but it was happening. And as marine food webs began to re-establish themselves in the early Triassic, they represented an expanding resource base, a growing abundance of prey that was available to any predator capable of exploiting it. The land-based reptiles of the early Triassic were ideally positioned to make this transition. They were already skilled predators, with sharp teeth, keen senses, and the kind of metabolic flexibility that allowed them to go for extended periods without food, a significant advantage in the unpredictable environments of the post-extinction world. They lived in coastal and riverine environments in many cases, already spending time near water. And the genetic and developmental raw material for aquatic adaptation, the limb bones that could be modified into flippers, the body proportions that could be streamlined, the physiological systems that could be tweaked toward water retention and deep diving, was all present in their basic reptile body plan, waiting to be shaped by natural selection. What followed was one of the most rapid and dramatic series of evolutionary transitions in the vertebrate fossil record. Within a few million years of the end Permian extinction, multiple separate reptile lineages had independently begun moving into marine environments. This is one of the key facts that makes the story of marine reptiles so extraordinary. It did not happen once as a single, unique evolutionary event. It happened multiple times in multiple lineages, driven by the same fundamental pressures and opportunities. The ocean called, and several different groups of reptiles answered simultaneously. The earliest marine reptiles of the Triassic were, by the standards of what would come later, relatively modest in their aquatic adaptations. Take the group known as the Eosauropterygii, early members of the lineage that would eventually give rise to the famous plesiosaurs. The earliest members of this group, from the very beginning of the Triassic period, still looked very much like land animals that happened to be spending a lot of time in the water. They retained functional limbs rather than flippers. Their bodies were not dramatically streamlined. Their teeth suggested a diet of fish and other aquatic prey, but their overall body plan had not yet been dramatically restructured by aquatic life. But the direction of evolution was clear. With each successive generation, natural selection was favoring individuals with slightly longer, slightly more paddle-like limbs. It was favoring individuals with slightly more streamlined bodies, slightly denser bones that helped with buoyancy control, slightly more salt-tolerant physiologies. The changes were small generation by generation, but they were consistent and directional. And over millions of years, they accumulated into something utterly transformed. Similarly, from other starting points and through other evolutionary pathways, other reptile lineages were beginning their own journeys toward the sea. Some of these early aquatic experiments would prove to be evolutionary dead ends, groups that developed modest aquatic adaptations, but never achieved the full commitment to marine life that the most successful groups eventually achieved. Others would blossom into some of the most spectacular and successful marine predators in the history of the planet. To understand how these transformations worked, how a land-dwelling reptile becomes, step by step, a fully marine animal, it helps to think about the specific biological challenges that any air-breathing vertebrate faces when it moves into an aquatic environment. These challenges are not trivial, and the solutions that evolution found to them are among the most elegant and instructive examples of adaptation in the natural world. The first challenge is locomotion. Water is approximately 800 times denser than air, and moving through it requires entirely different mechanical strategies than moving through the air on land. A land animal's legs, designed for pushing against a solid substrate, are largely useless for swimming. They create drag without generating efficient propulsion. An effective aquatic animal needs to either undulate its body to generate thrust, like a fish, or use modified limbs as paddles or hydrofoils, like a modern sea turtle or penguin. The transition from legs to flippers involves the shortening and broadening of limb bones, the reduction and fusion of individual digits, the development of webbing or cartilaginous padding between the fingers and toes, and the modification of the shoulder and hip girdles to accommodate the different mechanical demands of aquatic propulsion. All of these changes are visible in the fossil record, documented in exquisite detail in the skeletal anatomy of transitional forms. The second challenge is thermoregulation. Reptiles are ectotherms. They rely on external heat sources to maintain their body temperature. On land, this is relatively straightforward. A reptile can bask in the sun, move between patches of shade and sunlight, or choose microhabitats with appropriate temperatures. In the open ocean, these options are largely unavailable. Deep water is cold, and the temperature gradient between the warm surface and the frigid depths creates additional challenges for any animal that needs to dive. The marine reptiles solved this problem in various ways. Some may have evolved the ability to generate at least some metabolic heat internally, a phenomenon known as endothermy or at least regional heterothermy. Others may have restricted themselves to warm surface waters. Some may have used their large body size as a form of thermal inertia, being so big that their core body temperature changed only slowly even when swimming through cold water. The details vary across groups, but the challenge of thermoregulation in an aquatic environment was real, and addressing it was a key part of the evolutionary story of each marine reptile lineage. The third challenge is breathing. This is perhaps the most fundamental of all. A reptile breathes air. It has lungs, not gills, and it cannot extract dissolved oxygen from water the way a fish can. Every marine reptile, no matter how perfectly adapted to underwater life it became, retained this basic constraint: it had to breathe air. This meant periodic returns to the surface to breathe, which in turn meant that deep diving behavior required either the physiological capacity to hold breath for extended periods or a lifestyle that kept the animal in relatively shallow water where the surface was easily accessible. The solutions that marine reptiles evolved to address this challenge included increased lung capacity, more efficient oxygen extraction and storage in blood and muscle tissues, the ability to slow heart rate and reduce metabolic demands during dives, and in some cases, body size large enough to carry substantial oxygen reserves. Some may have been capable of breath holds comparable to those of modern sperm whales or elephant seals, extraordinary physiological achievements for animals whose ancestors had never needed to hold their breath for more than a few seconds. The fourth challenge, and this one was perhaps the most critical of all for the long-term success of fully marine lineages, was reproduction. This is where the revolutionary achievement of the amniotic egg became, ironically, a constraint rather than a liberation. The amniotic egg, remember, was the key innovation that had freed reptiles from their dependence on water in the first place. But now, as some reptile lineages were moving back into the water, that same egg became a problem. It could not be laid underwater, the embryo inside needed to breathe air, and a waterlogged egg would suffocate. This meant that any reptile that was returning to the ocean either had to come back to land to lay its eggs, like modern sea turtles, or had to find a fundamentally different reproductive solution. Some early marine reptiles did continue to lay eggs on land, maintaining the beach-to-sea lifestyle that modern sea turtles still use today. But this is a compromise strategy, one that makes the reproductive females vulnerable to terrestrial predators, that requires extensive energy expenditure to haul out onto beaches, and that ties the entire population to the availability of suitable nesting beaches. For lineages that were becoming increasingly committed to a fully marine existence, this compromise became increasingly untenable. The solution that the most successful marine reptile lineages eventually evolved was viviparity, live birth. Instead of laying eggs, the females retained developing embryos within their bodies, nourishing them through a placenta or through the yolk of retained eggs, and giving birth to live young directly in the water. This eliminated the need to return to land entirely. A fully viviparous marine reptile was, reproductively as well as physiologically, a creature of the sea. It was born in the sea, it lived its entire life in the sea, and it gave birth in the sea. The umbilical cord connecting it to its terrestrial ancestry had been cut. The evolution of viviparity in marine reptiles is documented in some of the most extraordinary fossils ever discovered, specimens in which the preserved remains of embryos or even newborn young are found within or adjacent to the body of an adult female, frozen in the moment of birth or death by the geological processes that created the fossil record. These specimens are not just scientifically valuable, they are among the most moving artifacts in all of paleontology, intimate glimpses into the reproductive lives of animals that lived more than 100 million years ago. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we reach the fully evolved, magnificently adapted marine reptiles of the later Mesozoic era, the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, the mosasaurs, we need to understand the world into which they were born. We need to feel the texture of the Triassic period, to understand the environmental context that shaped the early evolution of marine reptile life, and to appreciate the diversity and richness of the evolutionary experiments that the Triassic Ocean witnessed. The Triassic world was a strange and often harsh place. In the immediate aftermath of the end Permian extinction, the planet was, in biological terms, devastated. The rich, complex ecosystems of the late Permian were gone, replaced by impoverished communities dominated by stress-tolerant generalists. The oceans, particularly, took a long time to recover. The disruption of carbonate chemistry and the depletion of oxygen in deeper water masses created conditions that were hostile to many forms of marine life for millions of years after the extinction event itself. But recovery, however slow, was inevitable. Life is extraordinarily resilient, and the raw material for ecological reconstruction, the surviving lineages of bacteria, algae, invertebrates, and vertebrates, was still present, waiting for conditions to improve enough to allow diversification and ecological reassembly. As the Triassic progressed, the oceans gradually recovered, fish diversified. Cephalopods, particularly the ammonites with their coiled shells, exploded in diversity and became one of the dominant groups in Triassic marine ecosystems. Reef-building organisms slowly rebuilt the carbonate reefs that had been devastated by the extinction. Marine food webs became progressively more complex and productive, and into these recovering oceans, from multiple directions and through multiple evolutionary pathways, came the reptiles. The diversity of early Triassic marine reptiles is genuinely astonishing, and it reflects the breadth of ecological opportunity that was available in the recovering seas. Different lineages were invading the marine realm from different starting points and experimenting with different ecological strategies. Some were pursuing fish in shallow coastal waters. Others were diving into deeper water in search of cephalopods or other invertebrates. Some were using ambush strategies, lurking among coastal rocks or in the turbid waters of river mouths and estuaries. Others were active pursuit predators, using speed and maneuverability to run down fast-moving prey in open water. Among the most fascinating of the early marine reptiles were the forms that are often grouped together under the informal label of Triassic marine reptiles. A diverse and ecologically varied assemblage that included creatures like the long-snouted, crocodile-like Thalattosuchia and the bizarre, flat-bodied Placodontia, whose crushing teeth and heavy, armored bodies suggest a lifestyle built around feeding on hard-shelled invertebrates, clams, mussels, sea urchins. By crunching through their shells with remarkable specialized dental batteries, the placodonts are particularly instructive examples of the kind of evolutionary experimentation that characterized the Triassic marine invasion. These were not streamlined, open-water speed merchants. They were broad, somewhat turtle-like animals with heavily built bodies and remarkably specialized teeth, broad, flat molars in some species, and in others, a combination of pointed front teeth for grasping and broad crushing teeth further back in the jaw. Some placodonts evolved elaborate shell-like armor on their backs and bellies, convergently resembling turtles to a degree that is quite striking. This armor may have served as protection against predators, but it may also have functioned in buoyancy control, providing ballast that helped keep these relatively buoyant animals at the seafloor while they foraged. The placodonts were ultimately an evolutionary dead end. They went extinct at the end of the Triassic period without leaving descendants, but they illustrate beautifully the range of ecological strategies that reptiles were willing to explore in the marine realm. While some lineages were evolving toward speed and open water predation, others were finding success in much more specialized, much more sedentary ecological roles that no previous vertebrate had occupied in quite the same way. Far more significant for the long-term history of marine reptile life were two other groups that first appeared during the Triassic, the ichthyosaurs and the lineage that would eventually give rise to the plesiosaurs. These two groups represent the earliest examples of the kind of profound, whole-body transformation that turns a land animal into a truly marine one, and their early evolutionary history is both fascinating and, in many ways, deeply puzzling. The mystery of ichthyosaur origins is one of the most tantalizing puzzles in vertebrate paleontology. By the time we have good fossil evidence of ichthyosaurs, from the very beginning of the Triassic period, within a few million years of the end Permian extinction, they are already highly adapted to marine life. The earliest known ichthyosaurs show body proportions and skeletal features that indicate a significant degree of aquatic specialization, yet their precise terrestrial ancestors remain unknown. We have not found the clear transitional series of fossils that documents the gradual transformation from land-dwelling reptile to the early, already quite aquatically adapted forms. The ichthyosaurs appear in the fossil record, essentially, as a mystery, already committed to the sea, their full evolutionary backstory hidden in the gaps of the geological record. What we do know about early ichthyosaurs tells a story of rapid and remarkable transformation. The earliest forms from the early to middle Triassic were already fully aquatic. They had lost the ability to move on land. They had begun the process of transforming their limbs into paddles, and their body proportions suggest a lifestyle spent entirely in the water. But they were not yet the highly streamlined, fish-like creatures that later ichthyosaurs would become. Early ichthyosaurs like Grippia and Ichthyosaurus were relatively elongated, somewhat eel-like in body shape, with body undulation playing a more important role in locomotion than it would in later, more derived forms. They were impressive aquatic predators, but they had not yet achieved the breathtaking hydrodynamic perfection that would characterize the group at its evolutionary peak. The transformation from these early, already quite aquatic forms to the ultimate ichthyosaurs of the late Triassic and Jurassic is one of the most beautifully documented evolutionary sequences in the fossil record. Over the course of tens of millions of years, ichthyosaur bodies became progressively more fish-like, more streamlined, more perfectly shaped by the physical demands of fast swimming in open water. The tail, initially relatively simple and undulating, developed into a powerful, lunate, crescent-shaped tail fin whose geometry is nearly identical to that of modern fast-swimming fish like tuna and mackerel. This is not coincidence. It is the direct result of natural selection finding the same optimal hydrodynamic solution through an entirely independent evolutionary pathway. The body became more robust and more torpedo-shaped, reducing drag. The paddles became shorter and broader, less useful for active swimming, more useful for steering and stability. The skull lengthened into a long, narrow rostrum lined with conical teeth perfectly suited for grasping slippery fish. The eyes enlarged to extraordinary dimensions, eventually becoming, in some ichthyosaur species, the largest eyes of any known vertebrate dinner plate-sized optical instruments capable of gathering light in deep, dark water. This gradual transformation is visible in the fossil record, not just in comparative anatomy, in the differences between earlier and later species, but also in the extraordinary soft tissue preservation that some ichthyosaur specimens display. Because ichthyosaurs often died and sank into anoxic, oxygen-depleted bottom sediments, where bacterial decomposition was slow or absent, some of their fossils preserve not just bones but outlines of their soft bodies. These outlines, drawn in dark carbon-rich sediment around the white bones, show us that the body shape of advanced ichthyosaurs was truly fish-like, complete with a dorsal fin on the back, which is not preserved in bone and would be unknown without these exceptional specimens. The dorsal fin of an ichthyosaur, like the dorsal fin of a shark or dolphin, was a purely soft tissue structure that prevented the animal from rolling as it swam. Its presence tells us that by the middle to late Triassic, ichthyosaurs had achieved a level of hydrodynamic refinement comparable to that of modern dolphins, animals that have had tens of millions of years of their own to fine-tune their aquatic adaptations. The parallel between ichthyosaurs and dolphins is one of the classic and most striking examples of convergent evolution in the history of life, and we will return to it in detail later. For now, it is enough to note that the physical demands of fast swimming in open water are so specific, so precisely constraining, that natural selection tends to converge on very similar solutions regardless of the starting point. The torpedo-shaped body, the crescent tail, the dorsal fin, the streamlined flippers, these features appear in ichthyosaurs, in dolphins, in sharks, and in tuna, all independently, all because they represent the optimal engineering solution to the problem of moving efficiently through water at speed. While the ichthyosaurs were charting their remarkable course toward fish like hydrodynamic perfection, the other great lineage of early marine reptiles was taking a very different evolutionary path, one that would lead to an equally distinctive, equally spectacular, but mechanically quite different kind of aquatic animal. The early sauropterygians, the group that would eventually give rise to the plesiosaurs, were present in the Triassic seas alongside the early ichthyosaurs, but they were pursuing a different ecological strategy and employing a different locomotor system. Where ichthyosaurs were evolving toward body and tail undulation for propulsion, the early sauropterygians were beginning to use their limbs as the primary propulsive organs, swimming in a way that is more analogous to the flight of a bird through air than to the swimming of a fish through water. This limb-based or wing-based propulsive strategy is unusual among aquatic vertebrates, but it is not unique. Modern sea turtles use a similar system, as do penguins, and the mechanical principles involved are well understood. By moving enlarged, flattened limbs in a figure-8 or figure-of-8 rowing motion, an animal can generate both lift and thrust, propelling itself through the water efficiently and with considerable maneuverability. The key evolutionary change that makes this strategy work is the transformation of the limbs from walking appendages into the functional equivalents of underwater wings, broader, flatter, with the individual elements, bones, muscles, connective tissue, reconfigured to generate the appropriate force vectors for lift-based swimming rather than the push-pull mechanics of walking. The early sauropterygians show this transformation in various stages of completion. The very earliest forms from the early and middle Triassic already show elongated, somewhat modified limb bones that hint at a swimming lifestyle, but they were probably still capable of movement on land, perhaps hauling out onto beaches to rest, or if they still laid eggs, to reproduce. As the Triassic progressed, their limbs became progressively more paddle-like, their bodies more streamlined, and their dependence on terrestrial environments more and more minimal. The most primitive sauropterygians include forms like Nothosaurus and its relatives, medium-sized, somewhat crocodile-like animals that probably inhabited coastal waters, using their long jaws and sharp teeth to catch fish in the manner of a modern crocodile or large heron. They were not fully marine in the way that the most advanced plesiosaurs would later be. They probably spent time on land, and their overall body plan retains many features that are more consistent with a semi-aquatic than a fully aquatic lifestyle. But they represent an important stage in the evolutionary journey, a stage at which the commitment to water was deepening and the adaptations for marine life were accumulating, but the final step had not yet been taken. That final step, the transition from the nothosaur grade of organization to the true plesiosaur body plan, occurred sometime during the late Triassic and early Jurassic, and when it did, it produced one of the most distinctive and instantly recognizable animal body plans in the entire fossil record. The plesiosaur body plan is unlike anything alive today. Imagine a large, barrel-shaped body, compact, deep, and relatively rigid, supported by 4 enormous limbs that function as underwater wings. The neck is elongated, often dramatically so, extending far beyond the front of the body and ending in a relatively small, sharp-toothed head. The tail is relatively short and probably bore a small fin at its tip. The overall impression is of an animal superbly designed for cruising through the open ocean at moderate speeds, using its powerful limbs to generate efficient, sustained propulsion, while its long neck gives it an extended reach for seizing fish from schools encountered during its travels. This body plan was so successful that it persisted, with variations and refinements, for more than 130 million years. From the earliest Jurassic to the very end of the Cretaceous, plesiosaurs were a constant and conspicuous presence in the world's oceans, evolving into hundreds of species across dozens of genera, occupying ecological roles ranging from small, fast fish chasers to enormous, deep-diving cephalopod hunters to colossal apex predators whose skulls alone reached lengths of 2 meters or more. But we are moving too fast. We are jumping ahead to the culmination of a story that in its early stages was still only just beginning. Let us return to the Triassic, to the world in which the first truly marine reptiles were establishing themselves, and follow the story more carefully from there. The late Triassic period was, for marine reptiles, a time of enormous diversity and ecological richness. The recovering oceans of the post-extinction world had, by this point, reassembled much of their lost complexity. Fish were diverse and abundant. Cephalopods, particularly the ammonites with their elaborately structured shells, and the belemnites, which looked somewhat like modern squid, were present in enormous numbers. Reef ecosystems, built by sponges and other colonial organisms, provided complex three-dimensional habitats for a wide variety of invertebrate life. And in, above, and around all of this biological richness, the marine reptiles were thriving. The late Triassic oceans were shared by ichthyosaurs, various sauropterygians, placodonts, and a number of other, less familiar groups, including the long-bodied serpentine thalattosaurs, whose exact ecological role is still debated, and the earliest members of various other lineages that would prove less persistent in evolutionary terms. The diversity of marine reptile life during this period was, in some ways, even greater than it would be at the peak of the classic Mesozoic marine reptile fauna during the Jurassic and Cretaceous. The Triassic was an age of experimentation, and the experimental palette was broad, but another catastrophe was approaching. At the end of the Triassic period, approximately 201 million years ago, the world experienced another major mass extinction event. This event, sometimes called the end Triassic extinction, was less severe than the end Permian catastrophe, but it was still a significant biological crisis. Again, massive volcanic activity, this time associated with the rifting apart of the supercontinent Pangaea, which was beginning to break up as the Atlantic Ocean started to open, was a major contributing factor. Again, the eruption of enormous volumes of volcanic gases triggered rapid climate change, ocean acidification, and widespread ecological disruption. The end Triassic extinction swept away many of the diverse marine reptile lineages of the Triassic. The placodonts disappeared. The thalattosaurs went extinct. Many of the other experimental Triassic lineages that had not achieved the full commitment to marine life that the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs had achieved were lost. What emerged from the end Triassic crisis was a reduced but more focused assemblage of marine reptiles, dominated by the ichthyosaurs and the plesiosaurs, both of which had survived the extinction event and were positioned to diversify dramatically into the ecological vacuums left by the lineages that had not survived. The Jurassic period, which followed the end Triassic extinction, was in many ways the golden age of these two great marine reptile groups. The oceans of the Jurassic world were warm, rich, and productive. The breakup of Pangaea was creating new seaways and expanding the available marine habitat. Epicontinental seas, shallow, warm bodies of water spreading across the surfaces of continental landmasses, provided ideal environments for marine life, combining the productivity of shallow water ecosystems with the expansiveness of the open ocean. And in these warm, food-rich Jurassic seas, both ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs underwent spectacular radiations, diversifying into an astonishing array of species and ecological roles. The ichthyosaurs of the Jurassic represent the pinnacle of the group's evolution. By this point, the transformation from terrestrial ancestor to fully marine predator was complete. These were animals that had no connection to the land whatsoever. They were born at sea, they lived at sea, and they died at sea. Their bodies were perfected for open water life in a way that no previous reptile had achieved. And the variety within this perfection was extraordinary. Different ichthyosaur species specialized for different prey types, different water depths, different hunting strategies. Ophthalmosaurus, one of the most famous Jurassic ichthyosaurs, possessed eyes so large that they have become the defining feature of the animal in popular imagination. Each eye was approximately 23 centimeters in diameter, roughly the size of a large dinner plate, making them the largest eyes of any known vertebrate relative to body size in the history of life. Eyes this large collect enormous amounts of light, and the most plausible explanation for their evolution is that ichthyosaurs was a deep diver, capable of descending to depths where sunlight barely penetrated, hunting prey in the twilight zone of the ocean. The preservation of sclerotic rings, rings of small bones that surrounded the pupils of ichthyosaur eyes, in some specimens has allowed researchers to calculate not just the size but the aperture characteristics of these remarkable optical instruments, and the calculations suggest light-gathering capabilities comparable to those of modern deep-diving marine mammals. Imagine what that would look like, a creature roughly the size and shape of a large dolphin, streamlined and powerful, plunging into the darkness of the open ocean, guided by those enormous eyes that could gather even the faintest traces of bioluminescent light from potential prey hundreds of meters below the surface. It is a vision of biological achievement that rivals anything in the modern natural world. Other Jurassic ichthyosaurs pursued different strategies. Temnodontosaurus, a large and formidable predator, may have occupied an ecological role comparable to that of a modern sperm whale, a top predator capable of taking large prey including other marine reptiles, large cephalopods, and sizable fish. Uranosaurus possessed an extraordinary elongated upper jaw that extended far beyond the lower jaw in a swordfish-like projection, a structure that may have been used to stun schools of fish with lateral slashes before picking up the stunned individuals at leisure, a hunting strategy employed by modern swordfish and sawfish through convergent evolution. The plesiosaurs of the Jurassic were equally diverse and equally spectacular. By the beginning of the Jurassic, the plesiosaur body plan had split into two major ecological groups that would persist throughout the rest of the Mesozoic era. On one side were the true plesiosaurs, the long-necked forms that retained and even exaggerated the elongated neck of their ancestral body plan, developing some of the longest necks of any known vertebrate in proportion to body size. On the other side were the plesiosaurs, forms in which the neck was shortened and the head greatly enlarged, producing a proportionally different animal more focused on the pursuit and capture of large, powerful prey. The long-necked plesiosaurs, which are in many ways what most people picture when they think of plesiosaurs, were ecological specialists. Their small heads and numerous, interlocking teeth were well suited to catching small, fast-moving prey, fish and squid primarily, and the extreme elongation of their necks may have served various purposes. Some researchers have suggested that the long neck allowed plesiosaurs to approach schools of fish from below, extending their heads upward into the school before the animals detected the predator's body. Others have proposed that the long neck allowed them to feed on prey in crevices and complex reef environments that their bodies were too large to enter directly. Whatever its exact function, the long neck of plesiosaurs was one of the most extreme anatomical specializations in the history of vertebrate life. Some species had necks containing more than 60 individual vertebrae, compared to the 7 that are standard for virtually all mammals, including giraffes. The plesiosaurs, in contrast, were the ocean's nightmare, apex predators of extraordinary size and ferocity. The Jurassic oceans were home to large plesiosaurs like Plesiosaurus and Leopleurodon, animals whose massive skulls and enormous, fang-like teeth indicate a top predator lifestyle, animals capable of attacking and killing virtually anything in the ocean. Estimates of the size of large Jurassic plesiosaurs vary and are often subject to revision as new and more complete specimens are found, but some individuals were certainly enormous, 10 meters or more in total length, with skulls exceeding 2 meters. These were the tyrannosaurids of the sea, the top of the food chain predators around which the entire ecology of the Jurassic Ocean was structured. But even as the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs were reaching their peak of diversity and ecological dominance in the Jurassic and early Cretaceous, another story was beginning, one that would, by the late Cretaceous, add a third great group of marine reptiles to the ocean's ecosystems, and that would culminate in some of the most fearsome predators that the ocean has ever known. To understand the origin of the mosasaurs, that third and final great group of Mesozoic marine reptiles, we need to step back from the ocean for a moment and look at what was happening on the land, because the mosasaurs did not come from a lineage with a long history of aquatic adaptation. They did not have the deep evolutionary preparation of the ichthyosaurs or the plesiosaurs. They came from the lizards specifically, from the lineage of lizards that would eventually give rise to the modern monitor lizards and their relatives. And they made the transition from land to sea far more recently, far more rapidly in evolutionary terms than the other groups we have been following. Mosasaur ancestors were, by all indications, large predatory lizards, terrestrial hunters somewhat similar in general body plan to modern monitor lizards, though perhaps quite different in specific anatomical details. They inhabited coastal environments in the early to middle Cretaceous period, and like many coastal predators throughout evolutionary history, they were spending increasing amounts of time in the water, exploiting the rich resources of the marine environment. The transition from coastal predator to full-time marine predator, from a lizard that hunted near the water to an animal that lived its entire life in the water, appears to have happened with remarkable speed in evolutionary terms. By the late Cretaceous, just a few tens of millions of years after the earliest definitive mosasaur fossils, the group had produced some of the largest and most formidably armed marine predators in the history of the ocean. The mosasaur body plan was different from both the ichthyosaurs and the plesiosaurs in ways that reflected its different ancestry and its more recent commitment to marine life. Where ichthyosaurs had evolved a fully fish-like body with a vertical tail fin and modified paddles for steering, and where plesiosaurs had developed their unique barrel-shaped body with 4 underwater wings, mosasaurs retained a more fundamentally lizard-like body architecture, an elongated, somewhat laterally flattened body propelled primarily by undulation of the powerful tail. With limbs that were modified into paddles but retained a more distinctly limb-like structure than the highly modified flippers of ichthyosaurs or plesiosaurs. In some ways, mosasaurs were the most lizard-like of the 3 great marine reptile groups, the most clearly legible in their anatomy as derived from a terrestrial starting point. But in other ways, they were among the most dramatically and successfully modified for marine life. Their skulls were remarkable weapon systems, long, powerfully built, lined with robust teeth that in some species were conical and spike-like for grasping slippery prey, and in others were rounded and crushing for dealing with hard-shelled ammonites and other armored animals. Some mosasaur skulls show evidence of a double-hinged jaw mechanism, similar to that seen in modern snakes, which are close relatives, that allowed them to open their mouths extraordinarily wide and swallow large prey items whole or in large pieces. The mosasaurs appeared in the fossil record at a particularly interesting moment, a moment when the other great marine reptile group, the ichthyosaurs, was in decline. By the Middle Cretaceous, ichthyosaur diversity had fallen dramatically from its Jurassic peak, and the last ichthyosaurs went extinct approximately 90 million years ago, well before the end of the Cretaceous. The reasons for this decline are not fully understood. Changes in ocean circulation patterns, shifts in prey availability, and competition with other predators have all been proposed, but the timing is suggestive. The late Cretaceous oceans, from which the ichthyosaurs were absent, were the hunting grounds of the mosasaurs in their full evolutionary flower, and those hunting grounds were extraordinary. The late Cretaceous world was one of the warmest in the history of the planet, with sea levels much higher than today and epicontinental seas spreading across vast areas of what are now continental landmasses. The oceans teemed with life, fish had diversified enormously, ammonites were present in staggering variety, and marine ecosystems had achieved a level of complexity and productivity that the world would not see again for millions of years after the extinction event that ended the Cretaceous. Into this world of warm, productive, life-filled seas, the mosasaurs expanded with remarkable evolutionary energy. Over the course of the late Cretaceous, they diversified into dozens of species spanning an enormous range of body sizes and ecological specializations. Some were relatively modest in size, less than 3 meters in length, and were probably specialists in small, fast-moving prey. Others grew to truly enormous dimensions. Mosasaurus itself, the animal that gave the group its name, reached lengths of perhaps 14 to 17 meters, longer than a school bus, comparable in size to the largest modern crocodilians, and considerably larger than the great white shark. Ichthyosaurus, another giant, may have been even larger, perhaps approaching 18 meters in some estimates, making it one of the largest predatory animals that has ever lived in the ocean. These giant mosasaurs were not simply large versions of their smaller relatives. They were ecological generalists of formidable capability, capable of taking almost any prey available in their environment. Stomach contents and tooth marks on bones from late Cretaceous marine deposits tell a story of diverse and opportunistic predation. Mosasaurs ate fish. They ate other marine reptiles, including smaller mosasaurs. They ate sharks. They ate seabirds. They ate ammonites. In the late Cretaceous ocean, the largest mosasaurs occupied a position at the very top of the food chain that few other animals, in any environment at any time in the history of life, have matched. As apex predators, the mosasaurs were the culminating expression of a process that had been building for nearly 200 million years, the story of reptiles returning to the sea and making it their own. From the tentative, semi-aquatic experiments of the early Triassic, through the increasingly committed and specialized marine adaptations of the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, to the explosive diversification of the mosasaurs in the late Cretaceous, the marine reptiles had assembled an extraordinary ecological legacy. They had demonstrated across hundreds of millions of years of fossil history that the transition from land to sea was not a unique or improbable event, but a recurring response to the opportunities offered by the marine environment, an opportunity that different reptile lineages, starting from different points and traveling along different evolutionary pathways, had exploited again and again with remarkable success. The story of how these animals moved, hunted, and behaved is one that paleontologists have been assembling for more than 2 centuries, using every tool that science has to offer. And in recent decades, the explosion of new analytical techniques has transformed our understanding of these animals in ways that earlier generations of researchers could not have imagined. Consider the question of ichthyosaur swimming speed. For most of the history of ichthyosaur research, estimates of how fast these animals could swim were based primarily on comparisons with modern fast-swimming fish, and on the general principles of hydrodynamics as applied to the ichthyosaur body shape. These methods suggested that large ichthyosaurs could probably achieve impressive speeds, perhaps comparable to those of modern tuna, which can sustain swimming speeds of around 8 to 10 kilometers per hour and achieve burst speeds considerably higher. But these were estimates based on analogy, not direct measurement. More recently, researchers have begun applying increasingly sophisticated computational fluid dynamics modeling to ichthyosaur body shapes, essentially running virtual simulations of water flowing around the reconstructed body shapes of these animals, and calculating the drag forces, thrust requirements, and optimal swimming speeds that emerge from these simulations. The results have generally supported the idea that well-adapted ichthyosaurs were extremely efficient swimmers, not necessarily the fastest animals in the water. The constraints of air breathing and the need to surface regularly would have imposed some limitations, but capable of sustained high-speed swimming over long distances in a way that was genuinely remarkable for reptiles. Similar approaches have been applied to plesiosaur locomotion, with interesting results. The flip-like oscillatory swimming style of plesiosaurs, using their limbs as underwater wings, turns out to be surprisingly efficient, and modeling studies have suggested that large plesiosaurs could achieve sustained swimming speeds that, while probably not as high as peak ichthyosaur speeds, were sufficient for effective long-distance migration and for the active pursuit of prey. The question of mosasaur locomotion has also received new attention in recent years, and here some of the most interesting findings have emerged. For much of the 20th century, the standard reconstruction of mosasaur swimming showed these animals undulating their bodies in the manner of a large sea snake, a side-to-side wave running down the body from head to tail. But evidence from exceptionally preserved specimens, including some with soft tissue outlines preserved, suggests that mosasaur locomotion may have been more nuanced than this simple picture implies. Some specimens appear to show evidence of a downward curving tail tip, suggesting that, like sharks and early ichthyosaurs, mosasaurs may have had a tail fin with a distinct lower lobe, which would imply that the propulsive force was generated primarily by the tail rather than by whole body undulation. This would make mosasaur swimming somewhat more efficient and perhaps faster than the snake-like model would suggest. The evidence for marine reptile sensory biology is equally fascinating. The enormous eyes of ichthyosaurs have already been mentioned, but other sensory systems were also highly developed in these animals. Fossil evidence suggests that many marine reptiles had well-developed lateral line systems, networks of sensory organs distributed across the skin of the head and body that detect pressure waves and vibrations in the surrounding water. These systems, shared with fish and modern aquatic amphibians, allow animals to detect the movements of prey or predators through the water even in complete darkness or at distances too great for vision to be useful. Hearing in marine reptiles is another area of active research. Modern marine mammals have evolved elaborate modifications of their ear anatomy to facilitate the transmission of sound through the dense medium of water. Because water conducts sound differently than air, the standard mammalian hearing apparatus is poorly suited to aquatic environments, and marine mammals have essentially had to re-engineer their auditory systems for the ocean. The skeletal evidence for hearing anatomy in marine reptiles suggests that similar, though not necessarily identical, modifications were occurring in these animals. Some ichthyosaurs in particular show features of the lower jaw and ear bones that could be interpreted as adaptations for conducting sound through the lower jaw and into the middle ear, a mechanism employed by modern dolphins and other cetaceans for underwater hearing. What did the world sound like to an ichthyosaur or a plesiosaur? We cannot know for certain, but the evidence suggests that the Mesozoic ocean was far from the silent, featureless environment it was once imagined to be. The diverse marine ecosystems of the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous would have generated a rich acoustic environment, the clicks and pops of invertebrates feeding, the low-frequency rumbles of water moving over geological features, the high-frequency vocalizations of other animals, the body-generated sounds of fast-moving fish. And the marine reptiles that moved through these waters were, in all probability, exquisitely tuned to detect and interpret the acoustic information that surrounded them. The evidence for marine reptile thermoregulation has been particularly transformed in recent years by the development of isotopic techniques, methods that use the chemical composition of fossil bones and teeth to infer the body temperatures of long-dead animals. These methods work by measuring the ratios of different isotopes of oxygen and carbon in the mineral matrix of fossil material. Because the isotopic composition of biological minerals depends in part on the temperature at which they were deposited, and because body temperature affects the metabolic processes that deposit these minerals, it is possible, in principle, to extract information about body temperature from the chemistry of fossil material, even fossil material hundreds of millions of years old. The application of these techniques to ichthyosaur fossils has produced some genuinely surprising results. Some studies have suggested that at least some ichthyosaurs maintained body temperatures significantly higher than the surrounding water temperature, a finding consistent with some degree of endothermy or at least regional heterothermy comparable to that seen in modern fast-swimming fish like tuna. If confirmed, this would be a remarkable finding. It would mean that ichthyosaurs had not only converged on the external body shape of modern dolphins, but had also, independently, evolved a similar internal thermal strategy. The parallel between ichthyosaurs and dolphins would then be even more profound than it appears from external morphology alone, but we must be careful here. Isotopic data from fossil material is subject to various sources of error and uncertainty, including the possibility of post-depositional alteration of the original chemical signatures. The interpretation of ichthyosaur thermoregulation remains an area of active research and genuine scientific debate. What is clear is that the question is now being asked with new and powerful tools, and that the answers, when they come, may fundamentally change our understanding of how these animals worked biologically. One of the most moving and intimate windows into the lives of marine reptiles is provided by the exceptional fossil deposits that preserve not just bones, but glimpses of behavior and life history. We have already mentioned the remarkable specimens that preserve embryos or newborn young within or beside the body of an adult, direct evidence of live birth in ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. But there are other exceptional windows as well. Some of the most extraordinary fossils in the world come from localities where the conditions for preservation were so exceptional that soft tissue outlines, stomach contents, and even traces of skin color and patterning have been preserved. The Halsmatten deposits in what is now southern Germany, dating from the early Jurassic period, have yielded some of the most spectacular ichthyosaur fossils ever found. Specimens so completely and exquisitely preserved that they can be displayed essentially as living impressions of the animals, revealing details of body shape, fin shape, and even skin texture that would be utterly inaccessible from bone alone. From these exceptional specimens, we can see that ichthyosaur skin was smooth and relatively featureless, not scaly in the way that most people imagine reptile skin, but more like the smooth, rubbery skin of a modern dolphin. This is consistent with the demands of hydrodynamic efficiency. A smooth surface reduces turbulence at the skin-water interface and reduces drag. Some specimens preserve color patterns as darker and lighter regions in the carbon film outline of the body, suggesting that at least some ichthyosaurs had patterned coloration, perhaps serving as camouflage, species recognition, or temperature regulation. Stomach contents preserved in ichthyosaur fossils have been particularly informative about diet. Hooks from belemnite arms, the small, claw-like attachment organs found on the tentacles of these squid-like cephalopods, are common finds in the abdominal regions of ichthyosaur skeletons, confirming that belemnites were a significant part of the diet of at least some species. Fish scales and bones are also found, confirming the piscivorous habits of many ichthyosaurs. In some cases, the stomach contents allow us to make surprisingly specific inferences about feeding ecology, the depth at which hunting occurred, the size range of preferred prey, even the hunting time of day, if the prey species have known behavioral patterns that can be used as inference tools. The fossil record of plesiosaurs has yielded similarly intimate details. Stomach stones, gastroliths, have been found associated with the remains of many plesiosaur specimens. These polished stones, sometimes numbering in the hundreds in a single individual, were swallowed by the animals and retained in the stomach, where they may have served as ballast to help control buoyancy, or as grinding stones to help break up food in the manner of a gizzard. The presence of gastroliths in plesiosaurs is itself a remarkable finding. It implies a behavioral sophistication in the management of buoyancy and digestion that goes well beyond simple predation. Plesiosaur stomach contents have also yielded important dietary information. Fragmentary remains of fish, small cephalopods, and invertebrates have been found associated with plesiosaur specimens, and the patterns of wear on plesiosaur teeth are consistent with the capture and consumption of small, soft-bodied prey rather than the crunching of hard shells. This dietary evidence, combined with the anatomy of the neck and jaws, supports the image of long-necked plesiosaurs as graceful, efficient hunters of fish and squid, animals that use their extraordinary neck length to extend their reach into schools of prey without alerting the entire school to their presence. For the mosasaurs, stomach contents and tooth marks on other bones have told a story of voracious, opportunistic predation at the top of the late Cretaceous food chain. Mosasaur-bitten bones from a remarkable variety of prey animals have been found, the spiral shells of ammonites bearing deep, V-shaped tooth marks, the bones of sea turtles showing evidence of crushing bites, the vertebrae of other mosasaurs marked by the teeth of larger individuals. This fossil evidence of predation behavior brings the ecology of the late Cretaceous ocean vividly to life, not as an abstract assemblage of species, but as a living, dynamic system in which these extraordinary animals were actively hunting, competing, fighting, and dying. The question of how marine reptiles behaved socially, whether they lived alone or in groups, whether they showed parental care, whether they had complex social structures, is one that the fossil record can only partially answer. But even the partial answers are fascinating. The evidence for gregarious behavior in some marine reptile species comes from mass mortality deposits, sites where the remains of many individuals of the same species, often of different ages and sizes, are found together in a single geological layer. These mass mortality beds could result from various causes: disease, storm events, toxic algal blooms, starvation during periods of prey shortage, but their consistent occurrence in some localities suggests that at least some marine reptiles were living in groups rather than as solitary animals. Modern large marine predators, including dolphins, sharks, and sea lions, show a range of social behaviors from near solitary to highly gregarious, and it seems likely that marine reptiles were similarly variable across species. The evidence for parental care is more limited but not entirely absent. The live birth preserved in exceptional ichthyosaur specimens is itself a form of parental investment. The energy cost of gestation and the physiological risks to the mother of carrying developing young represent significant investments in offspring survival that are typical of animals that provide at least some degree of care after birth. Whether ichthyosaurs or plesiosaurs provided active postnatal care, guarding their young, for example, or teaching them to hunt, is something that the fossil record simply cannot tell us directly. But the comparison with modern marine mammals, which almost universally provide extended maternal care, suggests that at least the more derived and physiologically committed marine reptiles may have done the same. As we move through the story of marine reptile evolution, it is important to step back occasionally and appreciate the broader context, the way in which these extraordinary animals fit into the larger narrative of life on Earth, and the ways in which their story illuminates fundamental principles of evolutionary biology. One of the most important of these principles is the concept of evolutionary constraint and opportunity. The marine reptiles were not blank slates that could be sculpted by natural selection into any shape that hydrodynamics might demand. They were built from the raw material of their terrestrial ancestry, anatomies, physiologies, and developmental programs that had been shaped over hundreds of millions of years for life on land. Every adaptation for marine life had to be built from these existing materials, modifying what was already there rather than creating something entirely new. This is why a plesiosaur, despite its extraordinary aquatic adaptations, still has 4 limbs, still has lungs, still has a skull built to the same basic architectural plan as a terrestrial reptile. It is why an ichthyosaur, despite its fish-like external appearance, has bones that are clearly recognizable as modified versions of the bones of its terrestrial ancestors. The history is always visible in the anatomy, no matter how far evolution has carried an animal from its starting point. And this historical constraint, this inevitability that each new adaptation builds on the foundation of what came before, is also what makes the convergent evolution of marine reptiles so striking and so informative. When ichthyosaurs and dolphins independently evolved the same streamlined body shape, the same crescent-shaped tail, the same smooth skin, and possibly even the same internal thermal strategies, they are doing so not because they share recent common ancestry, but because they are subject to the same physical laws of fluid dynamics and the same ecological pressures of life as active predators in the open ocean. The ocean imposes its demands on any air-breathing vertebrate that attempts to live in it, and those demands channel evolution along similar pathways regardless of the starting point. This is convergent evolution in its most dramatic and instructive form, a natural experiment, run multiple times over hundreds of millions of years, that demonstrates with compelling clarity just how constraining the physical environment can be and just how predictable, in some broad sense, the evolutionary response to those constraints can be. The marine reptiles are not just fascinating animals in their own right. They are the evidence for one of the most important and most beautiful principles in all of evolutionary biology. But they were also, ultimately, animals living in a world that was itself changing, a world subject to geological forces and cosmic accidents that no amount of biological adaptation could fully prepare any animal to withstand. And the story of the marine reptiles is not just a story of evolutionary triumph. It is also, in the end, a story of extinction, of what happens when the world changes too fast for even the most spectacularly adapted animals to survive. The end was not far off. But before we reach it, before we follow the marine reptiles to their final chapter, there are still more extraordinary adaptations to examine, more remarkable evolutionary milestones to understand. The story of how these animals solved the biological challenges of their environment is far from complete, and the details, as always, are where the true wonder lies. Consider for a moment the extraordinary adaptations for diving that must have developed in these animals. Any air-breathing vertebrate that dives, a duck, a penguin, a sperm whale, a human-free diver, faces a specific and serious physiological challenge. As depth increases, water pressure increases, and this pressure creates a cascade of physiological problems that must be managed if the animal is to survive. The compression of air-filled spaces in the body, the lungs, the middle ear, the sinuses, creates physical stress that can be painful or even fatal at significant depths. The increasing partial pressure of nitrogen in compressed air causes the gas to dissolve into the blood and tissues, creating the risk of nitrogen narcosis and, upon ascent, decompression sickness, the bends. And the supply of oxygen, fixed at whatever level was in the lungs at the moment of submergence, is steadily depleted by metabolism throughout the dive, while the accumulating carbon dioxide, the physiological trigger for the urge to breathe, must be suppressed or the diver will surface prematurely. Modern deep-diving marine mammals manage these problems through an extraordinary suite of adaptations. Their lungs collapse at depth, preventing the excessive compression of air into a dangerous high-pressure gas. Their blood has unusually high concentrations of hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein, allowing them to store more oxygen per unit of blood volume. Their muscles are dark with myoglobin, another oxygen-storing protein, providing an additional oxygen reservoir that can sustain muscle function during extended dives. Their heart slows dramatically during dives, the diving reflex, reducing overall oxygen consumption and directing remaining blood flow preferentially to the brain and heart, the organs most sensitive to oxygen deprivation. And in some species, networks of specialized blood vessels, redes mirabile, help manage the pressure-related dissolution of gases in the blood. How many of these adaptations did marine reptiles share? This is a question that the fossil record can only partially answer, but the evidence that is available is tantalizing. The bone density patterns of ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, which can be studied in cross-sections of fossil bones, show features consistent with adaptations for diving. Some groups have unusually dense, pachystotic bone that might have served as ballast for neutral buoyancy at depth, while others show more porous bone structure that could have facilitated the kind of collapse and compression that prevents the air compression problems of diving. The extraordinary eyes of some ichthyosaur species, as we have discussed, are most plausibly explained as adaptations for seeing in the dim light of deep water. And the body sizes reached by some of the largest marine reptiles, the giant plesiosaurs, the largest mosasaurs, are themselves consistent with the known tendency of deep divers to be large, because large body size increases the ratio of oxygen-storing tissue to oxygen-consuming surface area. The full picture of marine reptile diving physiology is still being assembled from fragmentary evidence, and it may never be known with the certainty that we have for modern marine mammals. But the outline that emerges from the available evidence is of animals that had achieved a remarkable degree of physiological specialization for aquatic life. Animals that were not simply terrestrial reptiles paddling awkwardly in shallow water, but committed, sophisticated marine animals whose bodies had been as thoroughly reshaped by aquatic life as those of any animal that has ever lived in the sea. The story of how marine reptiles reproduced, particularly the transition to viviparity and its consequences, deserves more attention than it has so far received, because it is in many ways the most fundamental and most far-reaching of all the adaptations for marine life. We have already established that the amniotic egg, for all its revolutionary significance in liberating reptiles from water, became a constraint once those reptiles began returning to the sea. The shell of an amniotic egg is permeable to gas but not to water. It allows oxygen in and carbon dioxide out while preventing the egg from desiccating on land. But in water, this gas permeability becomes a liability rather than an asset. A submerged amniotic egg would rapidly become waterlogged, its air spaces replaced by water, and the embryo inside would suffocate. A marine reptile that lays amniotic eggs must lay them on land, and must therefore retain a connection to terrestrial environments throughout its reproductive life. This constraint is real and significant. Modern sea turtles, the most familiar living example of a reptile that has returned to the sea while retaining egg-laying reproduction, demonstrate both its feasibility and its costs. Female sea turtles return to land every few years to lay their eggs, hauling themselves up beaches at night, digging nests with their rear flippers, depositing clutches of eggs, and then returning to the sea. The entire process leaves them vulnerable to terrestrial predators, requires enormous physical effort from animals that are imperfectly adapted for movement on land, and ties the survival of entire populations to the availability and accessibility of suitable nesting beaches. Modern sea turtles have survived with this constraint for tens of millions of years, demonstrating that egg-laying is not an absolute barrier to marine life. But it is a constraint, and the alternative, viviparity, offers significant advantages to any marine reptile lineage that can evolve it. The evolution of viviparity in reptiles more generally, not just in marine groups, has been studied extensively, and it is now understood to be one of the most frequently repeated evolutionary transitions in the history of vertebrate life. Viviparity has evolved independently dozens or perhaps hundreds of times in reptiles, often in response to environmental pressures that favor extended embryonic development within the protection of the mother's body. Cold climates where terrestrial egg incubation would be inefficient are one strong predictor of viviparity in modern lizards and snakes. Aquatic environments where terrestrial egg-laying is impossible are another obvious selective pressure toward viviparity. The transition from egg-laying to live birth involves a series of intermediate stages, each of which can be observed in living reptile species. The starting point is what is called oviparity with extended embryo retention. The female holds eggs within her body for an extended period before laying them, so that by the time the eggs are deposited, development is already well advanced and hatching occurs relatively quickly. From this intermediate stage, further evolution can lead to full viviparity, in which the eggs are never deposited at all, and the young are born fully formed after a gestation period within the mother's body. In marine reptiles, the transition appears to have occurred repeatedly and independently in multiple lineages. Ichthyosaurs were fully viviparous. The preserved specimens of females giving birth or carrying embryos confirm this unambiguously. Plesiosaurs appear to have been viviparous as well, though the evidence is less direct. The body plan of large plesiosaurs, with their relatively stiff bodies and limited mobility on land, makes it almost inconceivable that they could have hauled out onto beaches to lay eggs, and at least one specimen has been reported with embryonic material associated with it, though the interpretation of this specimen remains somewhat controversial. Mosasaurs were almost certainly viviparous. Again, their body plan essentially precludes terrestrial egg-laying, and direct evidence of viviparity in at least some mosasaur species has been reported from the fossil record. The full completion of viviparity, the point at which a marine reptile lineage was completely free of any dependence on terrestrial environments for reproduction, represents the final severing of the biological connection to the land. An ichthyosaur giving birth to live young in the open ocean, far from any shore, is in a profoundly different biological situation from a sea turtle dragging itself up a beach to lay eggs. The ichthyosaur has completed the transition back to the sea in the most fundamental sense, not just ecologically and physiologically, but reproductively. It is a creature of the ocean in its entirety, as committed to the sea as any fish. And this is one of the most remarkable aspects of the marine reptile story, the completeness of the transition. Evolution, working through the slow accumulation of natural selection over millions of generations, managed to take animals that had been thoroughly, profoundly adapted to terrestrial life, animals whose most revolutionary biological innovation had been the ability to reproduce away from water, and transform them, step by step, adaptation by adaptation, into animals as thoroughly committed to the ocean as anything that has ever lived in it. The journey from the first tentative wading in shallow water to the full-blown oceanic lifestyle of an ophthalmosaurus or a chronosaurus is one of the longest and most intricate journeys in evolutionary history. It spans hundreds of millions of years. It involves dozens of separate biological systems, each requiring its own suite of adaptations. It demands not just physical transformation but physiological transformation, the rebuilding from the inside out of systems that had been tuned for one environment and had to be retuned, step by painstaking step, for another. And yet it happened, multiple times, in multiple lineages, each time producing animals of extraordinary beauty, sophistication, and ecological success. The marine reptiles stand as testament to the power of natural selection and the depth of evolutionary time, a demonstration that given enough time, enough selective pressure, and enough raw biological variation to work with, evolution can accomplish transformations so profound that the starting point becomes nearly unrecognizable in the end point. This is the first part of a remarkable story. We have traced the origins of reptilian life, the conquest of the land, the catastrophic disruptions of mass extinction, the initial experiments with marine life, and the rise of the three great groups of marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, and the mosasaurs, through the Triassic, Jurassic, and into the Cretaceous. We have examined the extraordinary adaptations that allowed these animals to thrive in the ocean, their streamlined bodies, their modified limbs, their enormous eyes, their viviparous reproduction, their diving physiologies, their sensory specializations. In the second part of this story, we will follow these remarkable animals to their full flowering, the peak of diversity and ecological dominance that they achieved in the late Jurassic and Cretaceous seas. We will examine in greater detail the specific anatomical and behavioral adaptations of each major group, and we will follow the evidence for how these animals actually lived, how they hunted, how they navigated, how they interacted with each other and with the other animals of their ecosystem. And then we will follow the story to its end, to the cascading series of catastrophes that, 66 million years ago, brought the age of marine reptiles to a close and reshaped the ocean's ecosystems in ways whose effects are still felt today. The story is far from over. In fact, in many ways, we are only just beginning. We left our story at a remarkable moment, a moment suspended in the warm, blue vastness of the Mesozoic ocean, surrounded by creatures of extraordinary beauty and biological sophistication. Creatures that had accomplished something that on the face of it should have been impossible. Creatures that had taken the greatest evolutionary achievement of their ancestors, the liberation from water, the conquest of the land, and voluntarily, irresistibly, generation by generation, surrendered it. Not from failure, not from defeat, but because the ocean, ancient and vast and teeming with life, offered something that the land could not match, an almost limitless abundance of food, space, and evolutionary opportunity. We have traced the origins of this extraordinary story, from the first amniotes walking freely across a land their fish ancestors could never have reached, through the catastrophic extinctions that reshuffled the biological deck and opened new ecological possibilities, to the first tentative experiments in marine life that would eventually produce the most spectacular ocean predators the world has ever seen. We have watched ichthyosaurs evolve from eel-like coastal predators into hydrodynamically perfect, dolphin-like masters of the open ocean. We have seen plesiosaurs transform the basic architecture of a terrestrial reptile into the strange, magnificent, utterly distinctive body plan, 4 underwater wings, a barrel body, and that extraordinary neck reaching forward through the blue that would persist for more than 130 million years. We have witnessed the mosasaurs burst onto the scene from a lizard ancestry with startling speed, growing from coastal predators into the apex hunters of the late Cretaceous seas. Now, in this second part of our story, we go deeper. We examine these animals at the height of their powers, in the fullness of their ecological dominance, with all the extraordinary detail that the fossil record and the increasingly sophisticated science that reads it can provide. We follow each group through its evolutionary peak, exploring the specific adaptations, the ecological relationships, the biological strategies that made each one of these lineages so successful. We ask what it was actually like to be one of these animals, what the world looked and felt and sounded like from inside an ichthyosaur's streamlined skull, from beneath the sweeping paddles of a plesiosaur, from behind the massive jaws of a mosasaur. And then, with the full weight of that understanding behind us, we follow the story to its end. Because this story does have an end. A dramatic, catastrophic, world-reshaping end that came 66 million years ago and swept these magnificent creatures out of existence with the same geological suddenness with which the universe had originally called them into being. Understanding that end, why it happened, how it happened, what it meant for the ocean ecosystems that had depended on these animals for hundreds of millions of years, is as important as understanding the rise. Because the extinction of the marine reptiles is not just an ending, it is also a beginning. It is the moment at which the ecological stage was cleared for the marine mammals, the whales, the dolphins, the seals, that would eventually repeat the marine reptile story almost step for step, driven by the same pressures, following the same evolutionary pathways, arriving at the same extraordinary destinations. But that is the end of a much longer story. For now, let us return to the Mesozoic ocean at the height of its glory and spend time with the animals that made it the most spectacular marine ecosystem in the history of the world. Picture the ocean of the Middle Jurassic period, approximately 170 million years ago. The world looks nothing like it does today. The supercontinent Pangaea has been breaking apart for roughly 30 million years, and the Atlantic Ocean, still relatively narrow compared to what it will eventually become, is opening between the separating landmasses. The climate is warm, significantly warmer than the modern world, and there are no polar ice caps. Sea levels are higher than today, and warm, shallow epicontinental seas spread across vast regions of the continental interiors. These shallow seas are extraordinarily productive. Warmed by the sun and refreshed by nutrient-rich upwellings from deeper water, they support dense communities of photosynthetic plankton, the microscopic algae and cyanobacteria at the base of the marine food web. Feeding on this plankton are zooplankton, tiny crustaceans, larval invertebrates, small jellyfish, and feeding on the zooplankton are fish, cephalopods, and a vast range of invertebrates. The reefs built by sponges and other colonial organisms provide complex, three-dimensional habitats that further increase biodiversity. The food web is many-layered, diverse, and extraordinarily productive, and moving through this warm, life-filled water at every depth from the sun-bright shallows to the dim reaches far below are the marine reptiles. An ichthyosaur breaks the surface not far from a coral-encrusted seamount. It is a large individual, perhaps 4 meters in length, with the perfectly streamlined, torpedo-shaped body that its lineage has spent tens of millions of years perfecting. For a fraction of a second, its sleek back arcs above the waterline, and then it is gone, slipping back beneath the surface with barely a ripple. Its nostrils, positioned at the top of its rostrum, evolved there from the tip of the snout position of its terrestrial ancestors, have taken a single, efficient breath. It does not need to do this often. Its blood is rich in hemoglobin, its muscles dense with myoglobin, and its cardiovascular system is exquisitely calibrated to make maximum use of each breath before the physiological need to surface becomes urgent. Below the surface, moving in the clear blue-green water with effortless efficiency, the ichthyosaur enters a world of extraordinary sensory richness. Its enormous eyes, each one a biological telescope that dwarfs anything in the modern reptile world, detect the play of light on scales far below and ahead. A school of fish is moving in the middle distance, a shimmering silver mass that twists and turns in the current. The ichthyosaur adjusts its angle slightly, its 4 paddle-like limbs making subtle corrections to its trajectory, while the powerful, lunate tail drives it forward with each sweep. It is not swimming toward the fish directly, that would alert them too soon. It is approaching from below and behind, using the darker water beneath it as visual cover, its approach angled to minimize its silhouette against the bright surface above. The strike, when it comes, is explosively fast. The ichthyosaur's elongated jaws snap shut on a fish before the school has time to scatter fully. A second snap, a third, the fish disappear, scales glinting as they are swallowed whole. The school has exploded in all directions, the individual fish moving with their own extraordinary speed and coordination. But the ichthyosaur is already pivoting with startling agility for an animal its size, selecting another target from the dispersing school. In seconds, it has taken another fish and another. This is the hunting strategy of a consummate predator, efficient, fast, and economically precise. Not the brute force attack of a larger animal overwhelming its prey by size, but the targeted, high-speed interception of a specialist built to outmaneuver fast prey in open water. The ichthyosaur's entire body is an expression of this specialization, every curve, every proportion, every biological system tuned to the task of finding, pursuing, and capturing fast-moving fish and cephalopods in the open ocean. Later in the day, if time of day is even a meaningful concept for an animal that regulates its activity by internal physiological cues rather than by the position of a sun it rarely sees from below the surface, the same ichthyosaur might dive deeper. Following a trail of belemnites descending toward darker water, it descends steadily, its heart rate dropping as the diving reflex engages, blood flow redirected from peripheral tissues to the essential core organs. The light fades. The water becomes darker, cooler. At this depth, the pressure is significant, but the ichthyosaur's skeletal and physiological systems manage it without distress. Its lungs, already partially collapsed by the pressure, hold their remaining air in a compressed reserve. Its oxygen stores in blood and muscle sustain the tissues that need them. In the dimness, those enormous eyes come into their own. What appears as near darkness to any other animal is, to an ichthyosaur's light-amplifying visual system, a world of subtle gradients and ghostly luminescence. The bioluminescent flashes of cephalopods, communication signals, alarm responses, the byproduct of disrupted cells, appear to those vast eyes as bright beacons in the blue-black water. The ichthyosaur follows the light, adjusting its course, descending further still. And then its jaws snap shut on a belemnite, and then another, and then it is turning and rising toward the surface, toward the light, toward the precious next breath of air. This is what the fossil record, read through the interpretive lens of comparative anatomy and modern physiology, tells us that an ichthyosaur's life was like. Not a simple, primitive existence, not the sluggish, cold-blooded stereotype of a reptile basking on a rock, but a life of extraordinary biological sophistication. A life as complex, as physiologically demanding, and as ecologically refined as that of a modern dolphin or tuna. The ichthyosaurs of the Jurassic seas were not a single species or even a small group. They were a diverse radiation of dozens of species, spanning an enormous range of sizes and ecological specializations. Understanding this diversity is essential to understanding the ecological role the group played in Jurassic marine ecosystems. At the smallest end of the size spectrum were ichthyosaur species less than a meter long, small, agile hunters of tiny fish and crustaceans, perhaps occupying ecological niches comparable to those of modern small dolphins or fast-swimming fish. These smaller species were probably important mid-level predators in the Jurassic marine food web, connecting the abundant small prey base to the larger predators above them. At the larger end were the giants, animals that dwarfed even the largest modern dolphins and approached or exceeded the size of modern small whales. Temnodontosaurus, one of the largest Jurassic ichthyosaurs, reached lengths of perhaps 9 to 12 meters, with a skull over a meter long lined with powerful, robust teeth that could tackle prey far larger than the small fish preferred by its smaller relatives. These large ichthyosaurs were probably the top ichthyosaur predators of their ecosystems, apex predators whose diet included not just fish and cephalopods, but potentially other marine reptiles, large sharks, and any other substantial prey items they could overpower. The diversity of ichthyosaur teeth tells a particularly informative story about dietary specialization. Some species had numerous small, uniform, conical teeth, ideal for grasping slippery fish or squid. Others had fewer, more robust teeth, better suited to dealing with larger, harder prey. Some ichthyosaurs had teeth only at the front of the jaw, with a toothless, beak-like region behind, a dental architecture that suggests a specialized feeding strategy, perhaps filter feeding or the suction capture of soft-bodied prey. And some of the very largest ichthyosaurs appear to have been nearly toothless, a finding that has suggested, controversially, the possibility of filter feeding comparable to modern baleen whales in at least some giant ichthyosaur species. The suggestion of filter feeding in giant ichthyosaurs is one of the most intriguing and most debated proposals in recent marine reptile research. If confirmed, it would represent a truly remarkable case of convergent evolution, not just between ichthyosaurs and dolphins in their streamlined body form, but between ichthyosaurs and baleen whales in their feeding ecology. The ecological parallels between the Mesozoic marine reptile fauna and the modern marine mammal fauna would then be even more complete than they already appear to be. Every major ecological role in the open ocean, fast fish chaser, deep diving cephalopod specialist, large prey pursuit predator, filter feeder, would have been occupied in both the Mesozoic by marine reptiles and in the modern ocean by marine mammals. The ocean, it seems, has a relatively fixed set of major ecological opportunities, and the animals that fill them change over geological time while the roles themselves persist. The evidence for giant filter-feeding ichthyosaurs remains circumstantial, based primarily on the reduction or loss of teeth in some large specimens and on the analogy with modern filter-feeding whales. definitive evidence such as preserved baleen-like structures or unambiguous stomach contents consisting of tiny prey has not yet been found. But the hypothesis is taken seriously by researchers, and future fossil discoveries may resolve the question definitively. The plesiosaurs of the Jurassic world deserve equally detailed attention because the diversity within this group is at least as impressive as that of the ichthyosaurs, and the ecological stories it tells are in some ways even more complex. We have already established the fundamental division within plesiosaur evolution, the split between the long-necked plesiosaurs proper and the short-necked, large-headed pliosaurs. But within each of these groups, the range of variation is enormous, and the ecological implications of this variation are only now being fully appreciated. Among the long-necked plesiosaurs, the most extreme expression of neck elongation is found in the group known as the elasmosaurids, a family that would go on to produce some of the most extraordinarily proportioned vertebrates that have ever lived. In the most derived elasmosaurids, the neck contained more than 70 individual vertebrae and constituted more than half the total body length of the animal. To put this in perspective, if you were standing next to a large elasmosaurid plesiosaur, the neck alone would be longer than a school bus. What was this astonishing neck for? This question has generated more scientific debate than almost any other in plesiosaur biology, and the answers that have been proposed span a remarkable range of ecological hypotheses. The most straightforward interpretation is that the long neck extended the animal's feeding reach, allowing it to approach schools of fish or squid from a distance and strike into the school with its small-headed, tooth-lined jaws before the prey detected the body of the predator. This explanation has the virtue of simplicity and is consistent with the anatomy of the teeth and jaws, which are clearly adapted for catching small, agile prey rather than for overpowering large animals. But it raises the question of how a neck this long could have been used effectively. A neck of 70-plus vertebrae cannot be highly maneuverable, and actually directing the head toward a specific target with any precision would have been mechanically challenging. Recent biomechanical modeling studies have helped clarify the likely range of motion of elasmosaurid necks. These studies suggest that while the long neck could not have been raised high above the water in the serpentine, swan-like pose that was standard in early reconstructions, the muscles and the weight of the neck itself would have made this mechanically impossible. It was capable of significant lateral, side-to-side, and some vertical up and down flexibility, particularly in the sections closer to the head. This suggests a feeding strategy in which the animal moved through schools of prey and swept its flexible neck laterally to intercept individual fish or cephalopods, rather than making precise strikes at specific targets. Another hypothesis, less widely accepted but not entirely dismissed, is that the long neck was used for bottom feeding, extending downward from an animal floating or swimming above the seafloor to pick up prey from the sediment. This would explain why many plesiosaur fossils are found in association with gastroliths, the polished stomach stones mentioned earlier, which might have provided ballast to help a long-necked animal maintain position while feeding near the bottom. A third possibility, perhaps not mutually exclusive with the others, is that the long neck played a role in sexual selection, that individuals with longer, more impressive necks were preferred as mates by members of the opposite sex, leading to the kind of runaway selection for extreme neck length that sexual selection can produce in many species. This hypothesis is difficult to test with fossil evidence alone, but it is not inconsistent with what we know about the ecology and behavior of modern animals. Whatever its primary function, the long neck of elasmosaurid plesiosaurs represents one of the most extreme anatomical specializations in the history of vertebrate life, and it is a constant reminder that natural selection, given enough time and the right selective pressures, can produce biological designs that seem almost impossibly extravagant to our human sense of proportion. The plesiosaurs, the short-necked, large-headed branch of the plesiosaur family tree, present a very different but equally compelling evolutionary story. If the long-necked plesiosaurs were elegant, specialized fish chasers, the pliosaurs were the ocean's blunt instruments of mass destruction, animals designed by natural selection for one purpose above all others: the capture and dismemberment of very large prey. The pliosaur skull is one of the most formidable weapons systems in the history of predatory animals. In large species, it is massive, deep, wide, powerfully reinforced, and lined with teeth of extraordinary size and robustness. The teeth of large pliosaurs were not the numerous, small, fish-catching teeth of their long-necked relatives. They were long, robust, circular in cross-section, which maximizes strength in all directions, and deeply rooted in the jaw, the architecture of a tooth designed to grip and tear through the flesh and bone of large, struggling prey. The muscles that powered the jaws of a large pliosaur were enormous. The skull anatomy shows extensive areas for jaw muscle attachment that indicate a bite force that must have been truly terrifying. Leopleurodon, the famous Jurassic pliosaur that has become something of a cultural icon, was probably somewhat smaller than its most dramatic popular representations suggest. Most researchers estimate a maximum length of perhaps 6 to 7 meters for well-documented specimens, though possibly larger for the largest individuals. But even at 6 or 7 meters, Leopleurodon was a formidable predator by any standard comparable in size and ecological impact to a large modern orca, and probably capable of taking prey of similar size. The very largest pliosaurs known from the fossil record, however, were significantly larger than Leopleurodon. Specimens referred to Plesiosaurus and related genera include fragmentary remains suggesting animals of 10 meters or more. And from the late Jurassic of what is now Norway comes some of the most spectacular pliosaur material ever found, specimens including an enormous skull, nearly 2 meters in length, that belonged to a massive predator, sometimes called Predator X in informal usage. This animal, when restored based on comparison with better-known but smaller relatives, was estimated at somewhere between 10 and 15 meters in length, with a jaw capable of generating a bite force that would make even the largest modern predators look modest. What did an animal like this hunt? The honest answer is probably anything it wanted to. An apex predator of this size in an ecosystem as rich as the Jurassic Ocean would have faced few meaningful constraints on its prey choice. Fish, cephalopods, smaller marine reptiles including other pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs, large sharks, all of these were plausible prey items. The tooth marks of large pliosaurs have been found on the bones of ichthyosaurs, confirming that at least some pliosaurs were preying on other large marine reptiles. Given the size and power of these animals, it is difficult to imagine any animal in their ecosystem that could not, in principle, have been taken as prey. The four-flipper propulsion system of pliosaurs, the same underwater wing system used by their long-necked relatives, but in a much more powerful, much more heavily muscled configuration, gave them a combination of speed and maneuverability that makes them genuinely impressive even by modern standards. Recent hydrodynamic modeling of pliosaur locomotion suggests that these animals could achieve burst swimming speeds sufficient to intercept fast-moving prey, and that the coordination of 4 large hydrofoils gave them a degree of three-dimensional maneuverability, the ability to pitch, roll, and yaw in the water as well as change speed, that was probably superior to the more restricted maneuverability of tail-propelled swimmers. Imagine, then, a large pliosaur on the hunt. It is not a surface animal. Its body is built for sustained, powerful swimming at depth. It moves through the middle water column with deceptive ease, those 4 enormous flippers generating thrust with each powerful oscillation. Its small, sharp-eyed head is constantly scanning for the body-generated pressure waves of large prey, for the visual signatures of movement in the water around it, perhaps for the acoustic signals generated by the swimming of other large animals. When it detects prey, an ichthyosaur perhaps, or another plesiosaur, It does not charge immediately from a great distance. It approaches carefully, using the darkness of deeper water as cover, closing the distance patiently before the final explosive acceleration that brings those enormous jaws into contact with prey that has no warning and no meaningful defense. This is the ecology of an apex marine predator operating at the top of one of the most productive and diverse ocean ecosystems in the history of the planet. It is an ecology that shaped not just the biology of the plesiosaur itself, but the biology of everything around it, the ichthyosaurs and smaller plesiosaurs that lived in constant awareness of plesiosaur predation risk, the fish and cephalopods whose own populations were regulated by the presence of these large predators, the entire structure of the Jurassic marine food web that had the plesiosaur at its summit. The ecological relationship between predator and prey in the Jurassic Ocean was not a simple, linear hierarchy. It was a complex, dynamic network of interactions in which every species was simultaneously predator and prey, competitor and facilitator, driver and responder. Understanding this network, the full ecological context in which the marine reptiles lived, is essential to understanding why these animals evolved the way they did and why they were so successful for so long. The Jurassic Ocean food web was built on a foundation of microbial and phytoplankton productivity, just as modern ocean food webs are. The warm, nutrient-rich shallow seas of the Jurassic were extraordinarily productive by the standards of modern temperate oceans, more comparable in their biological richness to modern tropical reef systems than to the open temperate ocean. This high primary productivity supported dense populations of zooplankton, which in turn supported enormous populations of small fish and cephalopods. These small fish and cephalopods were the primary prey of the smaller marine reptiles, the smaller ichthyosaur species, the long-necked plesiosaurs, which were in turn the prey of the larger species, the giant ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs. But the food web was not a simple pyramid. It was a network with many cross-connections and feedback loops that we are only beginning to understand through the study of the fossil record and through comparisons with modern marine ecosystems. Sharks, for example, which were present in the Jurassic Ocean in considerable diversity, though very different from the dominant groups of modern sharks, competed with marine reptiles for some prey resources, while also being potentially prey for the largest plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. Large filter-feeding fish and possibly filter-feeding marine reptiles competed directly for the zooplankton and small fish resources at the base of the food web. Seabirds, or rather, the flying reptiles that occupied the aerial ecological niche that seabirds would later fill, plunged into the surface waters for fish, competing with surface-hunting marine reptiles for the same resources. This ecological complexity was not static. It evolved over time as new species appeared and old ones went extinct, as environmental conditions changed and selective pressures shifted. The Jurassic was not a single stable state, but a dynamic, changing world in which the marine reptile fauna was constantly evolving in response to both biological and physical environmental changes. One of the most significant environmental changes of the Jurassic was the progressive warming of the oceans that accompanied the continued breakup of Pangaea and the expansion of shallow, warm epicontinental seas. As the Jurassic progressed, the global climate became warmer and more equable. The temperature difference between the equator and the poles was smaller than in the modern world, creating a more uniform thermal environment across the ocean. This had profound effects on ocean circulation patterns, on the distribution of productive upwelling zones, and on the geographic distribution of marine life. For the marine reptiles, this warming climate was broadly favorable. It expanded the extent of warm, productive shallow seas in which they thrived and reduced the areas of cold, unproductive deep ocean that were less hospitable to their air-breathing, metabolically active lifestyle. The Jurassic was, in many respects, a world designed to support large marine reptile populations, and the fossil record reflects this. Jurassic marine deposits around the world are rich in marine reptile remains, documenting a fauna of extraordinary diversity and abundance. The transition from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous period, approximately 145 million years ago, brought changes to the marine realm that would ultimately reshape the entire ecosystem. These changes were not catastrophic. There was no major mass extinction at the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary comparable to those that had preceded and followed the Triassic, but they were significant, and their effects accumulated over the course of the Cretaceous to produce a late Cretaceous ocean quite different from the Jurassic one. One of the most important of these changes was the diversification of the teleost fish, the group that includes the vast majority of modern bony fish species. Teleosts had been present since the Triassic, but they diversified dramatically during the Cretaceous, developing new body plans, new behavioral strategies, new ecological roles. Their increasing abundance and diversity created both new prey resources for marine reptiles and new competitive pressures. The evolution of highly schooling behavior in some teleost groups, the tight, coordinated schools that make individual fish nearly impossible to target while making the school itself a concentrated resource, may have driven the evolution of specialized schooling fish predation strategies in some marine reptile lineages. At the same time, the ammonites, the coiled cephalopods that had been a dietary staple of marine reptiles since the Triassic, were themselves diversifying into an extraordinary range of forms during the Cretaceous. Some Cretaceous ammonites grew to enormous sizes. The colossal Parapusosia sepenridensis, for example, with a shell diameter approaching 2 meters, is one of the largest ammonites ever known. Others evolved bizarre, uncoiled shell forms, spiraling, hook-shaped, or straight-shelled variants that departed dramatically from the standard coiled plan and which may have adopted very different lifestyles from their coiled relatives. This ammonite diversity created both new prey opportunities and new challenges for marine reptile predators. Feeding on a 2-meter ammonite requires very different capabilities than feeding on a small, fast-swimming one. The ichthyosaurs, which had been so dominant in the Jurassic, were facing increasing challenges as the Cretaceous progressed. Their diversity declined steadily through the early and middle Cretaceous, with fewer and fewer species persisting as the period advanced. The reasons for this decline are genuinely unclear. There was no single obvious catastrophic event that drove it. Multiple factors have been proposed, including changes in ocean circulation that affected the prey distributions ichthyosaurs depended on, competition with other marine predators including early mosasaurs and increasingly diverse sharks, and possibly some factor related to reproductive strategy or developmental biology that made ichthyosaurs less able to respond to environmental changes. Whatever the cause, the ichthyosaur decline was real and eventually total. The last definitive ichthyosaur fossils come from deposits approximately 90 to 94 million years old, the middle of the Cretaceous period, tens of millions of years before the end Cretaceous mass extinction that would eventually claim the other marine reptile groups. The ichthyosaurs went extinct quietly, without drama, their passing leaving a gap in the marine predator community that would be filled in the subsequent millions of years, partly by the expanding plesiosaurs and partly by the rising mosasaurs. The plesiosaurs, meanwhile, were entering what might fairly be called the most spectacular phase of their long evolutionary history. In the Cretaceous, the group diversified into some of its most extreme and most impressive forms, animals that represent the ultimate expression of the two great plesiosaur body plans, pushed to their evolutionary limits by the selective pressures of the Cretaceous ocean. On the long-necked side, the elasmosaurids reached their peak diversity and their most extreme anatomical specializations during the Cretaceous. Elasmosaurus itself, the animal that gave the group its name, was described in the 19th century by the great American paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope, who famously placed the skull on the wrong end, attaching it to the tail rather than the neck in his first reconstruction, before the error was pointed out by his rival Othniel Charles Marsh. The irony of this mistake is considerable, given that the whole point of an elasmosaurid is the extraordinary neck. Getting that wrong rather dramatically changes the animal's appearance. When correctly reconstructed, Elasmosaurus was an animal of breathtaking proportions, perhaps 14 meters long overall, with a neck of more than 5 meters containing 72 individual vertebrae. The body, by comparison, was relatively compact, perhaps 3 or 4 meters of torso, supported by 4 large, wing-like paddles. The head was small and delicate, with numerous slender teeth interlocking in a pattern well suited to trapping small, slippery prey. Imagine such an animal moving through the warm, shallow Cretaceous seas, that extraordinary neck extending ahead of a body that, by its standards, barely moves, the neck sweeping in gentle curves through schools of fish, the teeth closing with precision on individual prey items before they can escape. But even Elasmosaurus was not the largest or most extreme of the Cretaceous long-necked plesiosaurs. Albertonix from the late Cretaceous of what is now northern Canada had a neck containing 76 vertebrae, more than any other known vertebrate. Other late Cretaceous elasmosaurids from various parts of the world reached similar or possibly greater extremes of neck proportion. These were the culminating expressions of an evolutionary trend that had been building for more than 100 million years, the gradual extension of the neck, vertebra by vertebra, generation by generation, pushed ever further by whatever selective advantage neck length conferred in the ecological context of the Cretaceous ocean. On the short-necked side, the Cretaceous plesiosaurs produced what many researchers consider the most formidable marine predators in the entire fossil record. Kronosaurus from the early Cretaceous of what is now Australia was a massive animal, approximately 9 to 10 meters long, with a skull more than 2 meters in length, that has become one of the iconic large marine predators of popular science. Its teeth were enormous, conical, deeply rooted, and robust enough to handle prey of considerable size and resistance. The jaw muscles that powered those teeth were extraordinary in their mass and leverage, generating a bite force that has been estimated as among the highest of any known predatory animal. The ecological role of large Cretaceous plesiosaurs like Kronosaurus is clear from both their anatomy and from the evidence preserved in the fossil record around them. These were the top predators of their ecosystems, the animals at the very summit of the marine food web, constrained by little or nothing in their prey choices, capable of taking virtually any animal they encountered in the water. Their presence would have been felt throughout the food web, not just through the direct effects of their predation, but through the behavioral responses of potential prey species, which would have evolved avoidance behaviors, defensive strategies, and spatial distributions shaped by the risk of plesiosaur predation. And then there was Plesiosaurus funke, the Norwegian giant sometimes called Predator X, which may have been the largest plesiosaur ever to have lived. The skull fragments recovered from the Jurassic Cretaceous transition deposits of Svalbard suggest an animal of genuinely enormous dimensions. With a skull approaching 2 meters in length and the body proportions typical of plesiosaurs, the complete animal would have reached lengths of perhaps 10 to 13 meters, comparable in size to a sperm whale, though built on a very different anatomical plan. An animal of these dimensions, with the jaw structure and tooth anatomy of a plesiosaur, would have been capable of delivering bite forces and handling prey of a scale that are difficult to fully comprehend. This was not a predator in the ordinary sense. This was a biological event, an animal whose ecological impact on every other species in its environment would have been as significant in its own way as the impact of a geological process. While the plesiosaurs were reaching these extraordinary evolutionary peaks, the world of the late Cretaceous was changing around them in ways that would ultimately determine their fate. The ocean was warming further. Sea levels were at their highest point in hundreds of millions of years, flooding vast continental areas and creating the warm, shallow epicontinental seas that characterized the late Cretaceous world. The atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide was significantly higher than today, driving the greenhouse warming that made the Cretaceous one of the warmest periods in the last several 100 million years. In this warm, productive ocean, the mosasaurs were in full flower. We have already introduced this group in broad terms as large, lizard-related predators that had made the transition from coastal to fully marine life in the Cretaceous and had diversified rapidly into dominant late Cretaceous ocean predators. But the full story of mosasaur diversity and ecology is even more remarkable than this brief introduction suggests. The diversity of mosasaurs in the late Cretaceous was extraordinary. More than 60 genera are currently recognized, spanning an enormous range of body sizes, skull forms, and dental architectures. This diversity reflects the range of ecological roles that different mosasaur species occupied in the late Cretaceous ocean, from generalist apex predators to specialized feeders on hard-shelled prey, from large, slow pursuit predators to small, fast ambush hunters. The giant mosasaurs, Mosasaurus, Tylosaurus, Haenosaurus, represent the extreme large end of the mosasaur body size range, and they are the animals that most people picture when they think of mosasaurs. These were truly enormous animals. Tylosaurus, one of the largest, may have reached lengths of 12 to 14 meters or possibly more in the largest individuals, dimensions that place it among the largest known predatory reptiles in the history of life. Its skull was long, powerful, and equipped with robust, conical teeth set in both the jaw bones and, uniquely among mosasaurs, the roof of the mouth. Additional tooth rows called pterygoid teeth that helped prevent prey from escaping once seized. The hunting strategy of giant mosasaurs like Tylosaurus was probably that of an active pursuit predator, using speed and power to run down prey in open water, relying on the undulating force of its massive tail and the steering provided by its paddle-like limbs to maneuver effectively even in pursuit of fast prey. Stomach contents associated with Tylosaurus fossils include fish, smaller mosasaurs, marine birds, sea turtles, and various other prey items, a dietary list that confirms the apex predator status of this animal and illustrates the breadth of its ecological impact. But the ecological story of mosasaurs goes far beyond the giants. Among the most ecologically interesting of the group are the specialized hard object feeders, mosasaur species whose teeth were rounded or blunt rather than conical, clearly adapted for crushing armored prey rather than piercing soft flesh. Globidans, whose name means globe teeth, had hemispherical teeth that look almost like ball bearings, extraordinary dental tools for crushing the shells of ammonites, sea turtles, and bivalve mollusks. This specialization freed globidans from competition with the larger, conical-toothed generalists. It was occupying an ecological niche that those animals could not efficiently exploit, feeding on resources that were relatively abundant in the late Cretaceous ocean, but inaccessible to predators not equipped to deal with heavy shell armor. Other mosasaurs specialized in different ways. Platecarpus had a more slender skull and smaller teeth than the large generalists, suggesting specialization for smaller, faster prey, perhaps primarily fish and cephalopods. Clidestes, one of the smallest mosasaurs, was a streamlined, agile predator probably occupying a niche comparable to that of a modern large tuna or mahi-mahi, a fast, open-water fish predator capable of explosive acceleration. Prognathodon had an enormously deep, robust skull and massive teeth that suggest an ability to handle very large, hard, or powerfully resisting prey. This ecological diversification within the mosasaurs, the filling of multiple distinct niches by different members of the same lineage, mirrors the ecological diversification that had been achieved earlier by the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. It is a pattern that recurs throughout the history of marine reptile evolution. When a lineage successfully establishes itself in the marine realm, it diversifies rapidly into the available ecological space, with different lineages specializing for different resources and different prey types. The ocean provides a rich and varied ecological landscape, and the evolutionary tendency of successful lineages is to spread across as much of that landscape as possible. The late Cretaceous ocean, with its enormous mosasaurs at the top of the food web, its diverse plesiosaurs occupying mid-level predator roles, its many species of sharks, its enormous diversity of teleost fish, its ammonites and belemnites and other cephalopods, its sea turtles and marine birds, all of it interconnected in a food web of extraordinary complexity and productivity, was one of the most spectacular marine ecosystems in the history of the planet. For tens of millions of years, this ecosystem had been assembling itself, accumulating diversity, refining its internal relationships, and producing the extraordinary cast of characters that populated it. And then 66 million years ago it was shattered. The end Cretaceous mass extinction, the event that killed the non-avian dinosaurs on land and the marine reptiles in the sea, is the most famous mass extinction in the popular imagination, and for good reason. Its consequences were so dramatic, so total in their effect on the dominant animals of the Mesozoic world, that it represents one of the most profound biological discontinuities in the history of life. The world before the extinction and the world after it are, in many important ways, entirely different biological worlds, different cast members playing different roles in the same ecological theater. The primary trigger of the end Cretaceous extinction is now well established. A large asteroid or comet, approximately 10 kilometers in diameter, struck the Earth approximately 66 million years ago in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, excavating a crater approximately 180 kilometers in diameter, the Chicxulub crater, and releasing an amount of energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons. The immediate effects were catastrophic on a scale that strains the imagination. A fireball visible from thousands of kilometers away, followed by massive tsunamis, continent-spanning wildfires ignited by the thermal radiation of re-entering impact ejecta, and most importantly for the long-term extinction pattern, a global dust and sulfur aerosol cloud that blocked sunlight for months to years, causing a dramatic collapse of photosynthesis worldwide. The collapse of photosynthesis was the key biological catastrophe. Without sunlight, plants and phytoplankton could not grow. Without plants and phytoplankton, the food webs that supported all other life began to collapse from the bottom up. On land, herbivores starved as plants died. In the ocean, zooplankton starved as phytoplankton crashed, and the fish and other animals that depended on zooplankton starved in turn, and the large marine predators that depended on those fish faced a food web that was literally dissolving beneath them. But the Chicxulub impact was not the only catastrophic event of the end Cretaceous. Geological evidence tells us that the impact occurred during a period of already intense volcanic activity, the eruption of the Deccan Traps in what is now India, one of the largest volcanic events in the last 100 million years. The Deccan eruptions had been releasing enormous volumes of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years before the impact, driving climate changes that were already stressing marine ecosystems. Some researchers argue that the Deccan volcanism was contributing to the decline of some marine reptile groups, particularly the ammonites, which show some evidence of declining diversity in the millions of years before the impact, even before the asteroid delivered the final blow. The combination of these two catastrophic forces, the impact winter caused by the Chicxulub event and the long-term climate disruption caused by the Deccan eruptions, created a perfect storm of environmental stress that pushed already stressed ecosystems beyond their breaking point. The resulting mass extinction was rapid by geological standards. Most of the characteristic Cretaceous fauna, including the mosasaurs and the plesiosaurs, appears to have disappeared within a geologically brief interval following the impact. The specifics of how individual marine reptile species responded to the extinction are difficult to reconstruct from the fossil record because the resolution of the geological record near the extinction boundary is limited. We can see that mosasaur diversity was high, and mosasaurs were ecologically dominant right up to the boundary. The last mosasaur fossils occur in sediments deposited very close to the extinction event itself, suggesting that the group went extinct rapidly rather than declining gradually. Plesiosaur remains are similarly found close to the boundary, though some researchers argue that plesiosaur diversity may have been declining in the latest Cretaceous before the final extinction. What we can say with confidence is that no mosasaur, no plesiosaur, no member of any marine reptile group that had flourished in the Mesozoic survived the end Cretaceous extinction. The geological record is unambiguous on this point. Before the boundary, these animals are present. Their remains are found in abundance in Cretaceous marine deposits around the world. After the boundary, they are absent, not reduced, not diminished, but completely gone. The great experiment of Mesozoic marine reptile life, which had been running continuously for more than 200 million years, ended in geological sudden silence. The extinction of the marine reptiles left the ocean's ecological structure profoundly disrupted. The complex food webs of the late Cretaceous, the layered hierarchy of predators and prey that had been assembled over tens of millions of years, were dismantled almost overnight in geological terms. The top predator niches occupied by mosasaurs were empty. The mid-level predator roles filled by plesiosaurs were vacant. The specialized predation strategies that different marine reptile groups had developed over millions of years of evolution, the long-necked plesiosaurs' fish-trapping neck, the pliosaurs' devastating bite, the ichthyosaurs' deep-diving visual hunting, the mosasaurs' crushing jaws, all of these were gone, their practitioners eliminated. What remained in the immediate aftermath of the extinction was an ocean of survivors, organisms that had somehow come through the catastrophe, their populations reduced and their ecological roles temporarily undefined. Small fish, many invertebrates, sharks, sea turtles, and various microbial and plankton groups survived at different rates and to different degrees. The ocean was not entirely empty, far from it. But it was ecologically impoverished in ways that would take millions of years to fully repair. The recovery of marine ecosystems after the end Cretaceous extinction is itself a fascinating story, one that illustrates how resilient life can be in the face of catastrophe, and how the ecological opportunities created by extinction drive the evolution of new forms to fill vacant roles. The Paleocene epoch, which followed immediately after the extinction, was a period of ecological reassembly, surviving lineages diversifying and filling the vacant niches left by the extinct groups. And among the most significant of the lineages that would eventually fill those vacant niches were the ancestors of the modern marine mammals. We have reached the part of the story where the extraordinary parallel between the marine reptiles and the marine mammals becomes impossible to ignore, where the template established by 200 million years of reptilian ocean domination is essentially repeated, step by step, by a completely different group of animals making the same fundamental transition from land to sea. The first whales, or more precisely, the land-dwelling ancestors of the first whales, were members of a group of even-toed hoofed mammals, related to the ancestors of modern hippos, that began spending increasing amounts of time in water sometime around 50 million years ago. The transition from land to sea in these early whale ancestors followed the same basic pattern as the marine reptile transitions that had preceded it by tens to hundreds of millions of years. Initially, the ancestors of whales were semi-aquatic, wading in shallow water, feeding on fish and other aquatic prey accessible from the margins of rivers, lakes, and coasts. Over millions of years, their limbs modified toward paddle-like structures, their bodies streamlined. Their nostrils migrated from the tip of the snout toward the top of the head, creating the blowhole that is one of the most distinctive features of modern whales and dolphins. Eventually, they evolved viviparity, live birth in the water, and severed the last connection to the terrestrial environment of their ancestors. The parallels with the marine reptile transitions are striking and are not coincidental. They reflect the same fundamental evolutionary logic. The ocean imposes specific physical demands on any large, air-breathing animal that attempts to live in it, and these demands channel evolution along similar pathways regardless of the ancestral starting point. The torpedo-shaped body reduces drag. The modified limbs provide steering and, in some configurations, propulsion. The posterior propulsive organ, whether the crescent tail of a fish or an ichthyosaur, the flukes of a whale, or the tail paddle of a mosasaur, provides efficient thrust. The large eyes and sophisticated sensory systems allow hunting in the three-dimensional darkness of the ocean interior. The convergence between marine reptiles and marine mammals is, in many ways, the most powerful demonstration of convergent evolution in the vertebrate world. It shows that the same physical environment, acting through natural selection on different biological starting points, can produce animals that are not just superficially similar, but similar at the level of fundamental adaptive strategy. The ocean has a certain set of things it requires of any large, air-breathing predator that wishes to live in it, and those requirements are specific enough that the evolutionary responses they elicit are highly predictable. The study of convergent evolution between marine reptiles and marine mammals has benefited enormously from the detailed comparative analysis that modern paleontology enables. By examining the fossil records of both groups in parallel, tracing the step-by-step transformation of terrestrial ancestors into fully marine animals in each case, researchers have been able to identify not just the similarities in the endpoints, but the similarities and differences in the evolutionary pathways that led to those endpoints. One of the most interesting findings of this comparative analysis is that the two groups, marine reptiles and marine mammals, did not always take the same routes to similar destinations. In some cases, the parallel is very close. Both ichthyosaurs and dolphins evolved streamlined, torpedo-shaped bodies with lunate tail flukes and smooth skin, and the anatomical details of how this was achieved are remarkably similar. In other cases, the solutions are similar in function but different in mechanism. Plesiosaurs and sea turtles both use limb-based propulsion, but the specific geometry of the limb movements differs between the groups. These differences in the details of convergence are scientifically informative because they reveal the constraints imposed by different ancestral starting points. Ichthyosaurs started from a basic lizard body plan, while dolphins started from a basic mammal body plan, and while both lineages were driven towards similar body shapes by the demands of the ocean, the different starting materials left different fingerprints in the final products. An ichthyosaur's tail fin is vertical and propelled by lateral body undulation, like a fish's tail. A dolphin's tail fin is horizontal and propelled by dorsoventral, up and down undulation, a legacy of the mammalian ancestors' tendency toward dorsoventral rather than lateral spinal flexibility. Same function, different mechanism, because the evolutionary history imposed its own constraints on what natural selection could build. This kind of detailed comparative analysis is only possible because of the extraordinary richness of the marine reptile fossil record, a record that, over nearly 2 centuries of paleontological research, has accumulated to the point where we now have detailed knowledge of dozens of species from each major group, spanning the full extent of each group's evolutionary history. The quality of this fossil record is itself a remarkable scientific resource, and it continues to improve as new specimens are found and as new analytical techniques are applied to existing collections. The rate of new discovery in marine reptile paleontology has, if anything, been accelerating in recent decades. New species are being described every year, and some of these new discoveries are forcing significant revisions in our understanding of the evolutionary relationships and ecological diversity of the group. Particularly exciting have been discoveries from regions of the world that were poorly sampled by earlier generations of paleontologists: Antarctica, South America, Africa, Asia, which are now yielding marine reptile remains that document the truly global distribution of these animals and the remarkable consistency of their evolutionary patterns across different geographic regions. Among the most significant recent discoveries have been specimens that document early stages of the transition from land to sea in various marine reptile lineages, the transitional fossils that help fill in the gaps in the evolutionary sequence between terrestrial ancestors and fully marine descendants. These fossils are scientifically priceless because they allow us to actually observe, in preserved anatomical detail, the intermediate stages of some of the most profound evolutionary transformations in vertebrate history. Consider, for example, the remarkable early ichthyopterygia from the earliest Triassic, animals that are significantly more aquatically adapted than any known terrestrial reptile ancestor, yet significantly less specialized than the highly derived ichthyosaurs of the Middle and Late Triassic. These animals occupy the crucial middle ground in the transition sequence, documenting the kinds of body proportions and anatomical features that characterize the early stages of ichthyosaur evolution. The discovery of more such transitional forms, and there is every reason to expect that continued fieldwork will produce them, will progressively fill in the picture of how ichthyosaur evolution actually proceeded. Similarly exciting are recent discoveries that have revised our understanding of plesiosaur origins. For many years, the ancestral plesiosaurs, the early sauropterygians from which the fully marine plesiosaur body plan was derived, were known primarily from European localities. But recent discoveries from China and other parts of Asia have documented a diversity of early sauropterygians that significantly expands our knowledge of the earliest stages of plesiosaur evolution, suggesting that the group may have originated in the shallow tropical seas of the ancient Tethys Ocean, the great east-west seaway that separated the northern and southern continents throughout much of the Mesozoic, and radiated outward from there. The mosasaurs, too, have been the subject of important recent discoveries that have revised our understanding of the group. Particularly significant are findings that help document the origin of the group from terrestrial lizard ancestors, the earliest stages of the mosasaur transition to marine life, which have historically been poorly documented compared to the later, fully marine forms. Recent discoveries of early mosasaur relatives from the Middle Cretaceous, animals that were clearly still significantly more terrestrial than the later, fully marine species, are beginning to fill in this crucial part of the mosasaur story. One aspect of marine reptile evolution that has received increasing attention in recent years is the question of biogeography, the geographic distribution of different species and groups, and what that distribution tells us about how these animals moved through the world's oceans, how their populations were connected or isolated, and how geographic barriers and pathways shaped their evolution. The Mesozoic world, with its different continental configurations and different ocean arrangements, had a very different biogeographic landscape from the modern world. The Tethys Ocean, the warm, shallow seaway that extended east-west between the northern supercontinent of Laurasia and the southern supercontinent of Gondwana, was a major corridor for the dispersal of marine life, connecting what are now the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean basins and allowing the free movement of marine animals across much of the tropical belt. The progressive opening of the Atlantic Ocean through the Jurassic and Cretaceous created new geographic connections between previously separate ocean basins. The periodic opening and closing of seaways between continents created intermittent connections and barriers that profoundly affected the distribution of marine species. The geographic distribution of marine reptile fossils reflects these biogeographic patterns in fascinating ways. Many plesiosaur genera are known from multiple continents, sometimes from deposits that are roughly contemporaneous, evidence that these animals were capable of long-distance ocean travel, crossing the Tethys and other Mesozoic seaways to establish themselves in geographically distant areas. The distribution of mosasaur species across the late Cretaceous epicontinental seas, which at the height of sea level rise covered enormous areas of what are now continental interiors, documents the geographic extent of these shallow water habitats and the ability of mosasaurs to colonize and diversify within them. The question of how marine reptiles navigated, how they found their way across featureless open ocean to specific locations, is one that the fossil record cannot directly answer, but that modern comparative biology can illuminate. Modern sea turtles are famous for their ability to navigate across thousands of kilometers of open ocean using a combination of magnetic field sensitivity, visual landmarks, and other sensory cues to return precisely to the beach where they were hatched, years or decades later. If sea turtles, animals that are in many ways less cognitively sophisticated than the large predatory marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, can achieve this degree of navigational precision, it seems reasonable to infer that at least some Mesozoic marine reptiles had comparable navigational capabilities. The magnetic sensitivity that underlies sea turtle navigation is based on the detection of the Earth's magnetic field by specialized cells containing magnetite, a naturally magnetic mineral in the nervous system. These cells function as biological compasses, providing information about both the direction and the intensity of the local magnetic field, which together give the animal a kind of biological GPS that allows it to determine its position on the Earth's surface. This capability appears to be widespread in vertebrates. It has been documented in birds, fish, and various other groups, and there is no reason in principle why it could not have been present in Mesozoic marine reptiles. The implications of magnetic navigation capability in marine reptiles are significant. An animal capable of navigating by magnetic field has access to the entire global ocean as a potential habitat. It can move between productive feeding grounds in different ocean regions, return to specific locations for breeding or birthing, and integrate the use of widely separated areas into a coherent annual life cycle. This kind of wide-ranging, navigation-enabled lifestyle is characteristic of many modern large marine predators, sperm whales, great white sharks, bluefin tuna, and there is good reason to think it was also characteristic of at least some Mesozoic marine reptiles. The question of how marine reptiles gave birth, and specifically, the details of the birth process in fully aquatic species, is one that the exceptional fossil specimens documenting live birth have illuminated in ways that are both scientifically informative and genuinely moving. The most famous specimens documenting ichthyosaur viviparity are the Halsmatten fossils from Germany, several specimens in which young ichthyosaurs are preserved in various positions relative to the adult skeleton. In the most dramatic of these specimens, the young appear to be emerging tail first from the body of the adult, head last, just as in modern dolphins and other aquatic mammals that give birth in the water. This tail first birth orientation is an adaptation to the aquatic birth environment. If the young were born head first, the head, and particularly the all-important nostrils, might be exposed to water during the extended process of birth, before the young animal could breathe. By being born tail first, the young animal's nostrils are the last part to emerge, maximizing the time before its first breath is required and giving it the best chance of making that first breath successfully once fully born. The parallel with modern cetaceans, dolphins, and whales is immediate and compelling. Modern dolphins also give birth tail first for exactly the same reasons, and the adaptive logic is identical. Delay the emergence of the breathing apparatus until the moment of birth is complete, then allow the newborn to take its first breath of air at the surface. The ichthyosaur fossils documenting tail first birth were made before the connection to cetacean birth had been fully appreciated, but when the comparison was eventually drawn, it became one of the most vivid and compelling examples of convergent evolution in the entire paleontological record, extending the parallel between these two great groups of independently evolved marine vertebrates beyond body shape and physiology to encompass even the mechanics of birth itself. Other ichthyosaur birth specimens show young in positions that appear to document the moments immediately before or after birth, curled within the body cavity, partially emerged, or lying adjacent to the mother's skeleton in a position consistent with having just been born. These specimens, taken together, paint a picture of ichthyosaur birth as an event that occurred in the open water, away from land, with the newborn young entering a world of ocean rather than a world of air. From the very first moment of its existence, an ichthyosaur was a creature of the sea. The lifespan of marine reptiles, how long they lived, how quickly they matured, how many young they produced over a lifetime, is another area where the combination of fossil evidence and comparative biology has produced increasingly detailed pictures. Bone histology, the microscopic study of the internal structure of fossil bones, reveals growth patterns that can be used to estimate age at death and growth rate during life. Like modern reptiles, marine reptiles appear to have had variable growth rates that depended on factors including food availability, temperature, and reproductive status. Some species may have grown relatively quickly during early life before slowing markedly after reaching reproductive maturity, a pattern seen in many modern large reptiles and in some marine mammals. The evidence from bone histology suggests that at least some large marine reptiles lived for many decades, potentially comparable to the lifespans of modern large marine mammals. A giant plesiosaur or a large mosasaur may have taken many years to reach full size, and once fully grown may have lived for 50 years or more. If so, these animals were not just ecologically dominant in the short term, they were fixtures of their ecosystems over the generational time scales of human experience, individuals whose long lives allowed them to accumulate the kind of learned experience, knowledge of productive hunting grounds, navigation routes, seasonal prey movements that can be ecologically significant in long-lived predators. The sensory world of marine reptiles, what they could see, hear, smell, and feel, is an area where the fossil record provides tantalizing glimpses but inevitably leaves much to the imagination. We have already discussed the extraordinary visual capabilities suggested by the enormous eyes of some ichthyosaurs. But vision was not the only sense available to these animals, and understanding the full sensory toolkit helps complete the picture of how they interacted with their environment. The evidence for lateral line sensitivity in marine reptiles, the ability to detect pressure waves and vibrations in the water, comes from the distribution of small pits and grooves on the surface of fossil skulls. These features, called neuromasts, are the sensory organs of the lateral line system, and their presence on the skulls of many marine reptile species confirms that this fish-like sense was retained, or perhaps re-evolved, in animals that had returned to the water. A lateral line system allows an animal to detect the movement of other animals through the water even in complete darkness. The pressure waves generated by a swimming fish are detectable at considerable distances by a sensitive lateral line organ, giving a predator with this sense an almost supernatural ability to hunt in the dark. The olfactory capabilities of marine reptiles, their sense of smell, are harder to infer from skeletal anatomy, but some evidence exists. The olfactory regions of marine reptile brains, reconstructed from natural casts of the brain cavity inside fossil skulls, show variable development. Some groups appear to have had well-developed olfactory systems, while others show reduction of the olfactory regions consistent with reduced reliance on smell in an aquatic environment. Modern aquatic animals show a wide range of olfactory capabilities. Some sharks can detect chemical traces at extraordinary dilutions, while dolphins have largely lost their sense of smell, and it seems likely that marine reptiles were similarly variable. The acoustic world of the Mesozoic ocean, the sounds that marine reptiles would have heard and perhaps produced, is almost completely inaccessible through the fossil record. Modern marine mammals are famously vocal, and their vocalizations serve a wide range of functions including communication, mate attraction, navigation, and echolocation. Whether any Mesozoic marine reptiles produced vocalizations is unknown. There is no skeletal evidence that would confirm or deny this possibility, but the complexity of their social behavior and their long-distance movement patterns suggests that acoustic communication would have been advantageous, particularly for species living in the low light or dark conditions of the deep ocean. The legacy of the marine reptiles, what they left behind when they vanished 66 million years ago, is not just a biological one. It is also a scientific and cultural one. The discovery and study of marine reptile fossils has a history as rich and dramatic as the animals themselves, and this history is worth tracing because it is part of the larger story of how humanity came to understand the history of life on Earth. The first marine reptile fossils to be recognized as scientifically significant were discovered in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a period that coincided with the very beginnings of paleontology as a scientific discipline. The first ichthyosaur remains to be scientifically described were found on the coast of England in the early 19th century, in significant part through the remarkable work of Mary Anning, a self-taught fossil collector from the town of Lyme Regis who made numerous important discoveries of marine reptile fossils in the early decades of the 1800s. Anning's story is itself extraordinary, a woman of limited formal education and modest means who became one of the most important fossil finders in the history of paleontology, discovering complete specimens of ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and pterosaurs that transformed scientific understanding of the ancient world. She worked in difficult and sometimes dangerous conditions, searching the crumbling cliffs of the Jurassic coast for the fossils that weathered out of them, earning her living by selling specimens to wealthy collectors and scientists who often received the scientific credit for the discoveries she had made. The recognition of what these marine reptile fossils actually represented, extinct animals utterly unlike anything alive today, was itself a revolutionary conceptual step. At the beginning of the 19th century, the concept of extinction was not fully accepted. Many scientists believed that all animals that had ever lived were still alive somewhere, undiscovered in unexplored parts of the world. The ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, with their bizarre, unprecedented body forms, helped make the case that extinction was real, that life had a history, and that history included the permanent disappearance of lineages that no longer existed anywhere on Earth. This conceptual breakthrough, the recognition of extinction as a real biological phenomenon, was one of the necessary preconditions for Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, which appeared in 1859. Darwin's theory provided the explanatory framework within which the marine reptile fossils could be understood, not as arbitrary, disconnected examples of strange ancient creatures, but as the products of a coherent evolutionary process, linked to modern animals by chains of ancestry and descent, transformed from terrestrial ancestors by the same natural selection that drives all evolutionary change. The 2 centuries of marine reptile research that have followed Darwin's great synthesis have progressively deepened and enriched this evolutionary understanding. Each new specimen, each new analytical technique, each new theoretical framework has added another layer of detail to the picture of how these animals lived, how they evolved, and how they fit into the broader history of life. The story that can be told today with all its detail about hydrodynamic modeling, bone histology, isotopic paleothermometry, and molecular phylogenetics is immeasurably richer than anything that could have been imagined by the early 19th century scientists who first held ichthyosaur bones in their hands and struggled to understand what they were seeing. And the story continues to grow. New discoveries are being made every year. New techniques are being developed and applied to existing collections. New theoretical insights are reshaping our understanding of evolutionary processes. The marine reptiles, extinct for 66 million years, are as alive in scientific inquiry as they have ever been, a reminder that the past is not finished, that the fossils buried in the Earth's rocks are still speaking to us, still telling their story, still illuminating the extraordinary history of life on this planet. The broader significance of the marine reptile story, what it tells us about evolution, about life, about the natural world, deserves reflection as we approach the conclusion of our account. One of the most important lessons is the lesson of convergence, the demonstration, repeated multiple times across geological history, that the physical environment imposes specific and predictable constraints on the evolution of life within it. The ocean, with its demands for streamlined bodies, efficient propulsion, effective breathing strategies, and sophisticated sensory systems, has produced similar solutions in organisms as different as fish, marine reptiles, and marine mammals. The recurrence of these solutions is not coincidence. It is the signature of a physical environment that is constraining enough to channel evolution along predictable pathways regardless of the starting point. This lesson has implications that go beyond the specific case of marine reptiles. It suggests that evolution, while not literally repeatable in every detail, is predictable in its broad outlines when the environmental context is known. Given a warm, productive ocean and an air-breathing vertebrate lineage with access to it, the evolution of streamlined body form, limb modification, and live birth is highly probable, perhaps even inevitable, given enough time. The marine reptiles proved this once. The marine mammals proved it again, and the lesson holds. A second lesson is the lesson of resilience and renewal, the demonstration that life on Earth, though it can be catastrophically reduced by mass extinction events, is capable of remarkable recovery. The end Permian extinction destroyed more than 90% of marine species, and yet, within tens of millions of years, the marine realm had reassembled a complex, productive ecosystem, with new dominant groups filling the ecological roles vacated by the extinct ones. The end Cretaceous extinction removed the marine reptiles and severely disrupted marine food webs, yet within a few tens of millions of years, the marine mammals had risen to fill the ecological space left empty by the extinct reptiles. This pattern of destruction and renewal, of catastrophe followed by recovery, of extinction followed by adaptive radiation, is one of the most fundamental rhythms of biological history. It is not a comfortable rhythm. The extinctions that drive it involve the permanent loss of millions of species and the suffering of countless individual animals. But it is a real pattern, and understanding it is essential to understanding the history of life. A third lesson, perhaps the most fundamental of all, is the lesson of time. The story of the marine reptiles is a story of deep time, of processes and changes that unfold over millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of years. The human mind is not naturally calibrated for this scale. We think in terms of human lifetimes, of decades and centuries at most. The idea of a biological trend unfolding over 10 million years, of a neck getting longer, one vertebra at a time, generation by generation, for millions of generations, is almost impossible to fully grasp intuitively. And yet this is what happened. The marine reptiles are the proof. Deep time is the context in which all evolutionary stories must be understood, and the marine reptiles are among its most powerful illustrators. They demonstrate that given enough time, natural selection can transform a land-dwelling lizard into a creature that birthed its young at sea, a land-running ancestor into an animal with eyes the size of dinner plates adapted for the darkness of the deep ocean, a tail designed for walking into a propulsive organ of extraordinary hydrodynamic efficiency. The transformations seem impossible until you add the dimension of deep time, and then they seem not just possible but inevitable. As we bring this account to its close, let us make one final visit to the Mesozoic ocean, not to the dramatic moments of predation and birth and death that we have visited throughout this story, but to a quieter moment. A moment of contemplation, if such a thing can exist for an animal that lives by sensation and instinct rather than thought. Imagine a large elasmosaurid plesiosaur, late in the Cretaceous period, moving through the warm, shallow epicontinental sea that at this moment covers what will eventually be the interior of a continent. It is a calm day, the sun filtered through a thin haze of clouds, the water warm and clear to a depth of perhaps 20 meters before it shades into the deeper blue-green of the bottom. The plesiosaur moves slowly, those four enormous paddles stroking in their coordinated rhythm, the long neck extended ahead, the small head turning gently from side to side as the animal scans the water around it for prey. It has been alive for perhaps 40 years. In that time, it has traveled distances that would be remarkable even by modern standards, following the seasonal movements of fish populations through the shallow Cretaceous seas, crossing deeper water on journeys between productive feeding grounds, returning each year to the same warm shallows where the water is rich with the fish it prefers. It has survived encounters with mosasaurs. It has given birth in the open water to young that swam immediately and independently from the moment of their birth. It has eaten thousands of fish and squid and swallowed hundreds of gastroliths that roll gently in its stomach as it moves. It is unaware in any meaningful cognitive sense of what it represents of the 200 million years of evolution that have produced it, of the ancestors that walked on land, of the catastrophes that reshaped its lineage's evolutionary path, of the extraordinary biological achievements that its body embodies. It knows only what its sensory world tells it, the pressure of water against its skin, the light filtering down from the surface, the subtle disturbance in the water ahead that might be a school of fish, the deep, ancient physiological rhythm of its own heartbeat and breathing, but we know what it represents. We have followed the story from its beginning, from the first amniotes walking across a Permian landscape, through the catastrophes and recoveries and evolutionary radiations that produced this moment, to the extraordinary culmination of 200 million years of biological exploration. We understand, in a way that no previous generation fully could, what this animal is not just a curiosity from the fossil record, not just a dramatic illustration of prehistoric life, but a profound and moving example of what life on Earth can become when given enough time, enough variation, and enough selective pressure. The plesiosaur turns, following the disturbance it has detected in the water. Ahead, a school of fish is moving in the warm Cretaceous sea, silver flashes of movement in the blue-green water. The long neck extends, the small head positions itself, and the ancient, beautiful, extraordinary story of life's return to the sea plays out once more, as it has played out 10,000 times before in this animal's lifetime, as it has played out 10 billion times in the 200 million years of marine reptile evolution that have led to this moment. We are watching something that will not exist for much longer. In 2 or 3 million years, a geological eye blink, the world will change in ways that make this moment impossible. The asteroid will come, the fires will burn, the dust will block the sun, the food web will collapse, and this animal and all its kind will be gone, but the story will not be over. Life will recover. New animals will fill the empty niches. The marine mammals will rise and make their own extraordinary journey from land to sea. And the ocean, ancient and patient and enduring, will continue to call, as it has always called, to whatever air-breathing creatures stand at its margin and feel, in their ancient biological inheritance, the pull of its depths. This is the story of the marine reptiles. It is, in the end, a story about the relationship between life and the physical world, about how the environment shapes the organisms that live in it, about how evolution responds to opportunity and constraint, about how life, given enough time, can accomplish transformations so profound that they seem miraculous until you understand the process that produced them. It is a story that began 300 million years ago in a world we would barely recognize. It continued through catastrophes that reshaped the biological world not once but many times. It produced animals of extraordinary beauty and sophistication, animals that represent some of the most remarkable evolutionary achievements in the history of vertebrate life. And it ended 66 million years ago in a moment of cosmic violence that cleared the stage for the next act in the great ongoing drama of life on Earth. But nothing is truly lost in this story. The elasmosaurid that moves through the warm Cretaceous sea will die, and its species will go extinct, and its bones will sink into the sediment and turn to stone. And millions of years later, a member of an ape lineage will chip that stone away with careful hands and look at what is inside and begin to ask questions. And the questions will lead to answers, and the answers will lead to understanding, and the understanding will lead eventually to this story, to the full, rich, extraordinary account of what these animals were and how they came to be and what they mean. The marine reptiles are gone, but their story, read from the rocks that preserved them, is very much alive. And as long as there are people willing to read it, willing to do the patient, painstaking, endlessly rewarding work of learning to hear what the stones have to say, it will continue to illuminate the deep history of this extraordinary planet and the extraordinary life that has evolved upon it. The ocean called them back, they answered, and in answering, they wrote one of the greatest chapters in the history of life on Earth.